The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a Black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
Debate surrounds the name of Benjamin Tillman on the building and the removal of the Confederate flag. Those on both sides of the debate say the issue needs to be discussed in its rightful context.
Our own Jennifer Phillips is live outside Tillman Hall there on Clemson's campus with more on what's being said around the area.
Hey guys, that debate surrounds this building right behind me. Some see Tillman Hall as a historic place with a lot of legacy here on the campus. However, others see it as a symbol that divides people here on the campus. Spray painted in red on Tillman Hall at Clemson University are the words, "Tillman was a violent racist."
Someone like Benjamin Tillman and his honor probably belongs somewhere in a museum and not on a building.
A.D. Carson is a grad student at Clemson and a member of the organization See the Stripes. And although he doesn't condone vandalism, he says the name on this building should go.
To understand that building is also like a symbol to the world of what we honor here.
He says Tillman, a former South Carolina governor and founding member of Clemson, also made his mark as a racist and murderer.
So closely connected to racism, white supremacy.
And after the vandalism, a group rallied in front of Tillman Hall, waved Confederate flags, and raised one on a flagpole in front of the building. We found those pictures posted on the Facebook page called Sons of Southern Pride.
If a country is based on a lot of racism, we still don't go around honoring the racists.
He says Clemson's Board of Trustees voted to support removing the Confederate flag from State House grounds, but not removing Tillman's name.
This will hopefully complete the journey from the dome to the flag to the museum.
As a Clemson University trustee member,
I think it's important to put it in context.
Ambassador David Wilkins says diversity is part of the board's discussion, as well as Tillman Hall.
How we can improve diversity, how we can have more activities that relate to diversity.
But he says the Confederate flag and Tillman Hall aren't the same issue.
There's a difference between a flag that's sitting on the site of government, the site of sovereignty for your state, the State House grounds, and a building on a college campus.
But A.D. Carson calls that hypocrisy. The Board of Trustees here at Clemson is supposed to meet with the president sometime next week. Meanwhile, investigators with the Clemson University Police Department are investigating both the vandalism and are trying to figure out who raised the Confederate flag here in front of the building.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, July 17th, 2015. So I have been told. This is our fourth study session on the biography on former South Carolina Governor Benjamin Tillman. We are on Chapter 3, page 91, top of 91, Mr. Stephen Kantrowitz's work. The audio segment that you heard at the top, that happened last week. Dr. Kumanyika, black male, he was a guest on the program this week. He told us that this act did occur, where apparently some racists raised the Confederate flag on Clemson's campus at Tillman Hall in protest of what's been happening, the flag being lowered and all that, and just show that they're supportive of keeping Tillman Hall under the name of a staunch, unabashed white terrorist. Anywho, we will get cracking. Stay alert for any influence from the white author. Could be a racist. Keep alert just how this is presented Make notes if anything stands out. We will go ahead and get started. Again, we are in Chapter 3, top of page 91. Stephen Kantrowitz, Ben Tillman, and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, the C.O.W.S, audio segment number 1. Martin Gary, Sectional Hostility and the Coming Class War. Barely a year after Wade Hampton became governor, the Edgefield Advertiser already perceived two threats to white unity from within the anti-Reconstruction coalition itself. First, aristocratic planters might assume that Hampton's strategy of appealing to black voters could be continued indefinitely. It was but a short step from there to the domination of the party by a coterie of planter bosses manipulating an allegedly purchasable black electorate. Hampton's condemnation of fraud and intimidation in the campaign of 1876 struck up-country redshirts as dishearteningly obtuse, perhaps portending an outright betrayal of the straight-out legacy, the governor's rhetoric of inclusion and appeasement, and his claims that black Democratic votes had made the difference between defeat and victory in 1876 left the Advertiser's editor disgusted. Remember, he warned, that sentimentality about the Negro on paper and in speeches is an exceedingly different thing from a practical application of the Negro at the ballot box. The one is pretty, the other is the devil. The second danger came from below, not above. The Advertiser cautioned that white men who owned no land and employed no laborers might come to feel that they had no particular economic stake in the new order. Poor men throughout the country, the editor worried, unable to control any Negroes because of employing none and seeing themselves without any voice in the state they helped to save, would leave the Democratic Party, reorganize the Republican Party with the assistance of its old leaders, and defeat the landowners. Disgruntled whites might grow forgetful of the darkness of radical rule and array themselves against the organization of the party of law and order as independents or a working man's party. Drawing comparisons with the recent revolutionary ferment in Europe, the excitable editorialist imagined the establishment of a Southern commune. Clearly, something was needed to prevent reckless men, whether oligarchs or commoners, from again subjecting South Carolina to misrule. As an alternative to working-class radicalism or aristocratic tyranny, the Advertiser offered Martin Gary and the Redshirts as a model of white unity, martial manhood, and political virtue. In August 1878, the newspaper commemorated the role of Tillman and other Redshirts in the Hamburg and Ellington massacres by publishing a special issue printed in red ink. Gary and McKee Merriweather, the sole white casualty of Hamburg, were held out as emblems of virtuous white manhood, models of an unpretentious and uncompromising militancy that could once again save the day. The Edgefield's paper choice of local hero Gary as the embodiment of these virtues was not accidental, where the Edgefield lawyer and officer had already set himself in direct opposition to Governor Hampton. Gary made hostility to any black political participation a keynote of his political program as early as the 1878 campaign, arguing that politics is now and has been a question of race or struggle for supremacy between the races and not a mere contest for honest government as has been alleged. As Edgefield's delegate to the State Democratic Convention in 1878, he served on a committee that repudiated all fusion or coalition politics.
a Democratic newspaper nervously complained that Gary held the colored people up in contempt using language which certainly had a tendency to alienate them from the support of Governor Hampton. Gary argued for the repudiation of state debts accumulated under Reconstruction governments. He also objected to a tax for state-funded common schools since some of the proceeds would be used to educate blacks. For Gary, racial coexistence was a matter of domination and terror, not cooperation. He believed that violence could unseat Republican officials and intimidate black majorities without bringing either unmanageable labor unrest or federal intervention. The opponents of white supremacy deserved humiliation, not debate. He attacked Hampton's conduct during and after the 1876 campaign, alleging that Hampton had offered to withdraw the state's Democratic electors for president in exchange for Republican support for his own election. Hampton denounced Gary's claim as utterly and absolutely false and called his views unwise and dangerous, sealing the enmity between the two former Confederate generals. Gary's unmoderated posture disturbed powerful interests. Self-consciously genteel elites found his style of manhood crude and ill-mannered, and the state's emerging class of investment-oriented capitalists, championed by newspapers such as the Charleston News and Courier, worried that Gary's insistence on forcible self-assertion would perpetuate the state's reputation for anti-industrial backwardness. This conflict came to a head when Gary publicly defended the conduct of Colonel E.B.C. Cash, a Civil War officer who killed the eminent lawyer Colonel William Shannon in an 1880 duel. Cash had been on cordial terms with the wealthiest and most powerful men in the state, including Hampton. When Shannon became involved in debt proceedings that cast suspicion on Cash's wife, Cash expressed outrage at what he perceived as an attack on his wife's honesty. He challenged Shannon to a duel. The older man refused, but Cash persisted in his attacks until Shannon himself finally issued a challenge. When the duel ended with Shannon dead, contenders for the leadership of the Democratic Party split over the question of Cash's conduct. Some, inside and outside the state, saw Cash's pursuit of Shannon as a relic of a less civilized age and believed that Cash should be prosecuted for murder. According to Henry Grady's Atlanta Constitution, Cash had hounded a brave man into defying the laws against dueling, making the killing an act of cold-blooded murder. Newspapers from the Charleston News and Courier to the far up-country weeklies likewise waxed furious over this chivalric murder, and well they might. Urban and even small-town newspapers represented the interests of local capitalists who were increasingly likely to be merchants and whose livelihoods depended on their own and their communities' reputations for being safe for investment. But Cash had his allies. A supporter reported a conversation among a party of gentlemen to the effect that if any jury dared convict Colonel Cash and he was sentenced for murder, they would tear down any jail in the state in which he was held. Economic interest did not mechanically dictate personal loyalties or perceptions of law, custom, and honor, but where one sat did make a difference. Matthew Butler had been a leader in the violent campaign against Reconstruction, but he had since become a U.S. Senator and was now allied with the Hampton faction. Butler tried to find a balance between manly self-assertion and a more business-like personal politics, although careful to emphasize that dueling could be honorable when the rules of conduct were scrupulously observed. He suggested that Cash's behavior had been dishonorable and that he had trampled the law defiantly underfoot. In letters to Cash, Gary voiced his outrage at such equivocation and described Butler as the worst sort of hypocrite. After all, barely 4 years earlier, Butler himself had carried a challenge for Gary, the challenge to Dawson after the editor initially condemned the Hamburg Massacre. Butler's gift for neat rhetorical footwork no longer seemed as charming as it had when the audience had been Republican congressmen. Butler's new ally, Dawson, was a bastard, Gary fumed, a liar, a bribe taker, a coward, and a blackguard. In the end, Gary argued Cash's defense of his wife's honor was justification enough if Cash's foes saw nothing to admire in the protection of a white woman's good name. Gary explained, in God's name, what do they regard as sacred and worthy of fighting for? Gary's outburst in part reflected his frustrated political ambitions and growing personal enmity for former allies, but it also revealed a mounting struggle over the meaning of manhood in the post-Reconstruction South. Where did propriety lie? Was it a matter of men taking violent responsibility for themselves and their households as the exigencies of life as a slaveholder had fostered and demanded, or did manhood require the forbearance that preserved other forms of social peace, notably the need to maintain white supremacy and white male solidarity even at the expense of given white man's prerogatives? This tension between white men's individual and collective imperatives was not new, but it took on new meaning now that white manhood did not confer an exclusive and virtually automatic citizenship. More dramatically, even than during the secession crisis, the very notion of white patriarchal authority had come under attack, this time not by armies of abolition, but by traitors within the ranks. Once, submissionists had been a tiny, powerless minority in South Carolina politics. Now, it seemed, they governed. Gary understood attacks on Cash like criticisms of the Hamburg Massacre or the Edgefield policy as cowardly retreats from the principle that white men ought to use violence to defend their prerogatives. To men who clung to this vision of white patriarchal authority, fulminations against dueling were as ludicrous as new laws imposing the death penalty for rape. No man should allow the state or its leaders to tell him when he might or might not exact personal retributive justice. Gary's unpolished style, coupled with his support for policies such as usury laws, which limited the maximum interest rates, earned him a reputation in some quarters as the champion of the white plain folk. One supporter dubbed him the Great Commoner, leading the people's battles against the aristocrats and capitalists. This man recognized Gary's wealth but granted him honorary credentials as a representative of the plain folk. His much discussed volatility and disregard both for convention and for icons like Hampton could strike sympathetic observers as the violent self-assertion of a proud, brave, free man who will act and cannot be bound. To such devotees, Gary was the architect of redemption and the defender of ordinary white people's interests. He embodied white manhood unbridled, an alternative to the condescending moderation of the less worthy sons who wear the ermine and the laurel, Christian statesmen. For a time in 1880, it seemed that Gary might represent not the Edgefield editor's solution, but his darkest fears. According to one friendly source, he contemplated an independent challenge to the Democrat leadership on a platform promising homesteads, common schools, and self-sufficiency, all built on the foundation laid in 1876. In March 1880, Senator Butler warned a confidant of an impending split among white Democrats, claiming to know that certain parties are ready to run independent and will get the radical vote and some Democratic following. Butler's warning notwithstanding, however, Gary's bid for the governorship failed in the Democratic nominating convention, where up-country counties were, as always, underrepresented. Partisans later claimed that the leadership had promised Gary the nomination if he would remain within the party, then betrayed him once he agreed not to vote. The dominance of local elites in the nominating process makes it nearly impossible for us to gauge the depth of popular support for Gary, but his allies would argue forever after that he had been stabbed, cheated, and robbed of due political honor. Even after his untimely death in 1881, Gary's defiance made him an icon for white men disgusted with the arrogance of wealth. The Edgefield farmer who denounced Big Mr. Negro Farmer declared himself to be, on the question of seed cotton traffic, that M.W. Gary was in politics. Although Gary was dead, his combative iconoclasm in the name of white supremacy appealed to men who felt abandoned by their political leaders. Throughout the South, similar strains of class tension opened up space for independent challenges to democratic rule. Gary's correspondence with Cash during 1880 and 1881 had raised the possibility of a political alliance between the two mavericks, and as the 1882 campaign approached, some disgruntled Democrats turned their eyes to Cash. "The womb of the state is big with revolution," one man declared in a letter to the now notorious duelist, "and it is a matter for our decision whether we will act as midwives to its birth." As this discontent brewed within the party's ranks, local Democratic militants like Ben Tillman had been working to consolidate the electoral triumph of 1876. The Republicans had been devastated by their losses in 1876 and 77, but they were still formally entitled to a vote. As the election of 1878 approached, the chairman of the State Democratic Executive Committee urged local leaders to arrive armed and mounted and divide time at Republican meetings and to pressure poor blacks to vote the Democratic ticket. In the campaigns of 1878 and 1880, the Red Shirt Rifle Clubs, many now integrated into the state militia, remained as central to Democratic strategy as they had been in 1876. Throughout the upcountry, Democrats assaulted and murdered their adversaries. In addition to their roles in witnessing and harassing Republican assemblies, mounted companies disrupted voting where substantial Republican turnout was rumored or expected. In Okosin County, a Republican convention of less than 50 men was witnessed by 3 times as many mounted and uniformed Democratic partisans. A Democratic mass meeting in the same county drew 9 companies of red shirts. In some areas, well-organized displays of red shirt force became matters of routine. Elsewhere, the partisans arrived seeking to make a lasting impression. In Newberry County, 40 mounted horsemen from parts unknown came down upon the voters at one precinct, leaving at least 1 black man dead. Despite red shirt intimidation, numerous black Republicans voted in the 1878 and 1880 elections. In Beaufort County, black land ownership continued to rise throughout the 19th century, creating a viable black yeomanry in contradiction to white supremacist strictures. Robert Smalls led a vibrant Republican Party, but Democrats repeatedly stole elections, gerrymandered the districts of which Beaufort was a part, and contested Smalls' victories on the floor of Congress. As a result, the once enslaved Smalls spent frustratingly little time serving his constituents and much more time defending victories they had already won. These results could be interpreted in several ways. Democrats might relax, satisfied with the overall result, or they might continue to feel anxiety over the more than 15,000 Republican votes cast for the state's leading black politician. George Tillman shouted his party's defiance in the halls of Congress after its members ruled against him in a contested election case in 1882. Since 1876, the Caucasian has risen in his might and asserted his God-given right to rule where any considerable number of his people sojourn among the colored races. Anxiety about possible federal retaliation persisted, and Democrats sometimes sought to disguise their intentions. So soon as you read this, destroy it. Don't fail to do this, concluded one memorandum on tactics from the state Democratic chairman. Local Democratic officials continue to fear a renewed black Republican mobilization, and in the days before elections, they frequently wrote in panic about surreptitious Republican plans. The Negroes, though apparently inactive, are working with great energy, a partisan warned Orangeburg Democratic boss Sam Dibble. I've pried into their camps. We are in danger. This reflected long-standing white fears of collective action by African Americans, but it also worked tactically, helping ensure white Democratic turnout in heavily black districts. Seeking a surer foundation for Democratic, the state legislature crafted election laws designed to minimize black political power in the state. The Greenville News frankly described a restrictive registration law as an effort to keep the state in the hands of white men. The legislature redistricted the state, concentrating as many black voters as possible in a single low county district. The new 8-box law specified separate ballots and boxes for 8 categories of offices. Ballots for each office could list only the candidates for that office, and ballots placed in the wrong box by inattentive or illiterate voters would be discarded. The law required election managers to read the labels on the boxes if asked by the voters, a measure designed to allow officials to help like-minded voters overcome barriers of illiteracy. The legislatures intended the law to be applied racially, for by the early 1880s, most white voters supported Democrats and most black voters backed Republicans. Black Democrats hung on in a few low country areas, but their importance was more symbolic than substantive. Similarly, a few white men continued to support the Republican Party. In July 1880, for example, as Republicans crowded the Spartanburg County Courthouse to discuss the fall campaign, an upcountry Democratic newspaper acknowledged the presence of 50 or 60 whites among the participants. But white Republicans were heavily burdened by the bitter legacy of the federal occupation and the ever-growing legend of Republican corruption, and they remained outliers in a party that was almost entirely black. Such men were unlikely to be disenfranchised by a literacy test. They voted openly in the low country, the cities, and apparently in some far upcountry precincts. It may even have served the interests of white Democratic leaders to tolerate a few white Republican voters in some areas, since such men would offer constant targets for vilification and negative reference. But the onerous new voter registration law raised fears that poor white men as well as black men might be disenfranchised, and it came within a single vote of defeat in the state legislature. By June, as the 1882 elections approached, Democratic leaders were clearly growing nervous that the law might have backfired. Senator Butler publicly worried that white voters might be disenfranchised by the law. No nervous regard for consistency, fretted the Charleston News and Courier, should prevent the legislature from abolishing registration if it can be ascertained that registration will lessen the political power of the white people. The point, after all, the maintenance of the supremacy of honesty, intelligence, and capacity, not a foolish consistency that might undermine white Democratic rule. Such fears were apparently well-founded. The Democrats' laws and campaign tactics both limited the number of eligible voters and depressed turnout. Between the elections of 1880 and 1882, the number of votes cast for Democratic gubernatorial nominees plummeted from more than 117,000 to just 67,000. The first sign of mass protest against the Redeemers' stock and election laws came during the season of their passage, the winter of 1881 and 1882, when black farmers and farm laborers began to leave the state in unprecedented numbers. In the last week of 1881 in Edgefield alone, a reported 5,000 blacks departed for points in the Midwest and Southwest. One observer estimated that the migrants made up 20% of the local laboring population. Their departure inevitably drove up the price of labor, but Democratic leaders, unwilling to admit that fair range policies had negative economic consequences for employers, refused to concede that the stock law might be responsible for the exodus. Their analysis, though, bespoke a deep ambivalence about black South Carolinians generally. As the Charleston News and Courier put it, politically speaking, there are far too many Negroes in South Carolina, but from an industrial standpoint, there is room for many more. This telling contradiction would continue to vex those who, like Tillman, demanded both cheap labor and political hegemony. South Carolina's populist moment. By the time the Democratic leadership pushed through the stock and election laws, some white men had also had enough. The seemingly intractable crisis of the agricultural economy, refracted through the bitter social and economic conflict of the stock law, alienated many poor white men from the Democratic leadership. Some began to consider trading the wages of whiteness for a more tangible, less exclusive prosperity, seeking to forge electoral coalitions with black voters. The most successful of these coalitions was the Readjuster movement, which mobilized black and white Virginia voters behind former Confederate General William Mahone's promise to scale down the payment of the state's debt, secure male suffrage, and protect public education. In 1879, the Readjusters defeated the Democrats at the polls and took power in Virginia. By 1882, it appeared that South Carolina might follow the same path. In early 1882, a Democratic editor in far up-country Okosin County acknowledged that the stock law, the election laws, and appropriations for historically upper-class institutions such as South Carolina College, now the University of South Carolina, and the Citadel might have given some white men cause to believe and feel that the present government is no better than that of the radicals. The secretary of the Beach Island Farmers Club noted that the passage of the stock law by our legislature is creating much excitement and comment. Threats of a new party are made, and fear is entertained by some that it will harmonize the Democratic Party to such an extent that the state may be easily Mahonized. A white Fairfield County farmer named J. Hendricks McLean did indeed try to become South Carolina's Mahone. McLean was the same age as Ben Tillman and had shared many of the same experiences. He had lost a brother in the Civil War and had briefly left South Carolina in the 1860s to make a new start. He had become active in Democratic Party politics and had taken part in the Straight Out movement in 1876, but McLean had quickly become disenchanted with the Redeemer government, and through his grange he began organizing local Fairfield farmers behind a third-party alternative, the Greenback Labor Party. Greenbackers represented the deep-rooted producerist tradition of American radicalism described by historian Robert McMath as the idea that the producer deserves the fruits of his or her work. In this vision, money existed only to facilitate the exchange of goods, and the cult of hard currency benefited only non-producing middlemen and financiers. In an 1879 manifesto, McLean denounced the money power and called for greenback dollars and equitable taxation. Like Mahone, McLean sought coalition with black Republicans demanding free and fair elections and an end to racial and partisan discrimination. In 1880, McLean's efforts met with little success, but the events of the next 2 years created an opening for a radical change. The stock and election laws angered many black and white men. Cotton farmers suffered a particularly harsh year in 1881, and national Republican leaders began seeking to foster alliances with white independents throughout the South. The forces of political resentment, economic hardship, and partisan strategy came together to encourage the development of a grassroots movement. In mass meetings and conventions in 1882, Greenbackers denounced state laws and expenditures that seemed to benefit only an elite few, such as appropriations for the state's colleges. Greenback State Chairman W. W. Russell declared that the party's strategy was to organize the disaffected throughout the state, but he and other Greenback leaders understood the difficulties inherent in forging an alliance between discontented white Democrats and skeptical black Republicans, and they pursued a flexible strategy. Greenback clubs in some parts of the state included both white and black members. Greenback candidates for the governorship and many congressional seats received the state Republican Party's endorsement, but the two parties retained separate platforms. Greenbackers argued that economic interest, not race, should guide men's political choices, and they attacked white supremacy as a blind behind which Democrats passed class legislation. As Russell put it shortly before the 1882 election, the Democrats' election laws favored the literate and intelligent classes over the poor men of either race. The prejudices that could deprive the colored man of his vote, Russell declared, cover the contempt of the fortunate classes for those less favored. McLean similarly accused elite Democrats of fostering prejudice between the two races so as to be able to run the state government for their own benefit to the injury of both the white and colored taxpayers of the state. The critique was persuasive to more than a few hard-pressed white and black men. As greenback clubs formed throughout the state, even the Charleston News and Courier was forced to admit that some good and intelligent men are joining the Greenback Party. But South Carolina's populist moment faced daunting obstacles, for the Greenback Republican coalition rested on an unstable foundation of disaffection and expediency. Unlike Virginia's readjusters, who rallied to protect an existing system of public education, South Carolina's Greenbackers and Republicans mainly rallied against policies and leaders they disliked. Furthermore, Greenback leaders seemed willing, even eager, to gain the support of maverick Democrats, often men whose personal ambitions had been stymied in intra-party conflicts. The streams of elite and impoverished discontent came together most remarkably in the Greenback Labor Party's alliance with Cash, who accepted Greenback's support for his bid for the 5th District congressional seat. Russell even sought to recruit Red Shirt and Grange leader D. Wyatt Aiken, whose attacks on merchants and monopolies made him a lesser but still powerful symbol of the potential for mobilizing white men's discontent. Russell may have hoped that claiming Aiken would help blur the line between dissident Democrats and Greenbackers. Unsurprisingly, however, Aiken wanted to have nothing to do with the new party. As such recruitment efforts suggested, the term disaffected took in not only those poor white men who had lost their hogs and votes, but also those planters with grievances against merchant capital or the Democratic leadership. The Greenback Party's eagerness to claim such men stemmed in part from its need to attract credible leaders, men whose names, styles, or backgrounds made them reasonable representatives of white discontent. But it also sprang from most Greenbackers' common history as white Democrats and their effort to present their movement as the legitimate inheritor of the redemption legacy. Thus, Greenbackers as well as Democrats invoked the heritage of 1876. One Greenback leader announced his intention to mount a thorough canvass, a regular 1876 campaign in which Democrats would have to divide time with his party.
By mid-autumn, Greenback Republican fusion candidates were running in all 7 congressional districts, and Republicans had endorsed the Greenback state ticket. This interracial coalition left Democratic conservatives scrambling for explanations. A Democratic paper acknowledged that the fence law operates hardly on some of our people, but argued that supporting the Greenbackers would bring not relief but ruin in the form of a renewed and corrupt Republican government. In despair, the editor complained that the people seem to have forgotten there is any longer danger from misgovernment. Charleston News and Courier editor Dawson finally admitted that the stock law had been a hardship in some parts of the state, but he denied that this justified white men's abandonment of the Democratic Party. The Democrats insisted that the only alternative to their white supremacy was a return to the evils of black Reconstruction. Their 1882 campaign against the Greenback Republican Alliance drew heavily on the memory of Reconstruction and argued that white men should not allow their grievances to subvert white minority rule. In the South, one editor averred the alternative to white government and white supremacy could only be ignorance, corruption, and all that works financial and social ruin. The Democrats should not ignore white men's grievances, and Negro rule would be worse than anything and would make all other reform impossible. The only safe course for those who opposed the stock law or other policies such as the registration law was to hold together for white supremacy, and after it is securely won, we will fight all our other grievances. An Edgefield newspaper put it rather more emphatically: if we have family quarrels, for heaven's sake let us fight them out among ourselves and not go to our enemies for comfort. These writers were discovering belatedly that any credible white supremacy had to mean something more than electing white Democrats to office. Their own platform contained little of interest to white independents and offered black voters only the tired refrain of Hampton's support for public education. Furthermore, it was awkward for low-country urban Democrats to criticize the Greenback Republican Alliance. In coastal towns and counties of Georgetown, Beaufort, and Charleston, Democrats had been running fusion tickets with Republicans, splitting offices among races and parties in order to avoid economically destructive and potentially violent election fights. This strategy looked very similar to that of the interracial movement the Democrats ostensibly reviled. Philosophical inconsistency did not deter the Democrats from violent action. The Democratic campaign against the Greenbackers utilized the same tactics and the same men as used in previous campaigns, but one man at least took on a new degree of responsibility. In August 1881, Ben Tillman was elected second in command of the Edgefield Hussars, a red shirt rifle club that had become a state militia company. This new rank, coming close on the heels of his participation in the stock law campaign, represented Tillman's coming of age as a local leader. In June 1882, he became his township's representative to the County Democratic Executive Committee, and in July he attended the State Democratic Convention. In 1882, Edgefield's rifle clubs, including Tillman's Hussars, turned Democratic rallies into paramilitary events. A local Democratic weekly noted approvingly that Tillman had become
one of the most zealous and useful members of the partisan militia. It is not hard to imagine what combination of speech-making, coercion, and brute force constituted zealousness during the campaign of 1882. Speaking to discredit their opponents in the eyes of both black and white supporters, Democrats accused Greenback leaders of being violent white supremacists, but also of being incapable of defending themselves from other white men. As the 1882 election approached, Democratic newspapers distilled hostile accounts of McLean's life into an indictment headlined "Bully and Braggart," that purported to recount McLean's acts of terrorism as a Democratic vigilante leader in the 1870s. Russell stood accused of having voted for the Black Codes in 1865 and of supporting the stock law, positions with which the ruling Democrats of 1882 could not themselves take issue, but through which they hoped to discredit Russell in the eyes of black and poor white constituents. More directly, Democrats attempted to show that McLean and other Greenbackers were incapable of defending themselves, the tactic Gary had pioneered against black and white Republicans in 1876. When confronted by red shirt partisans at Winnsboro, they charged McLean had displayed cowardice. On that occasion, Democrats not only refused to let McLean speak, but also collared, pummeled, and kicked him as he turned to leave. McLean, apparently fearing a serious beating, retreated into a hotel parlor. Local Democratic boss Thomas Woodward, under whom McLean had apparently served in 1876, interceded to prevent the crowd from injuring his former colleague, but the Greenback nominee was foiled in his bid to speak. As presented to the state's readers in newspaper accounts, McLean's ordeal revealed that white supremacy could discipline whites as well as blacks. It also demonstrated the persistence of Reconstruction-era rhetoric that contrasted the lawlessness of white mobs with the restraint of white elites. In effect, by playing the master's game of promise and threat, Democrats set the ground rules for McLean's insurgency and established their right to decide when and where he could or could not speak. The red shirt rank and file, some Democrats the worse for drink, according to the paper, a crowd of belligerents, did the rough work. In this version, to Woodward fell the subtler task of mediating, appearing to stand outside the mob even as it did his party's work. Woodward appeared at a crucial moment, reportedly summoning the sheriff and others to ensure McLean's safety. But Woodward was not an outsider. He was, in fact, the leader of Winnsboro's Democrats. McLean's fate rested in the end in the hands of the Democratic Party, the same place it had been when the mob attacked. Less partisan observers might have been harder pressed to distinguish between this mob, restrained by respectable officers, and the red shirt militias performing their accustomed tasks. Newspaper claims that McLean and his confreres needed fear no violence at the hands of our people could be seen as disingenuous, or as Democrats' declaration of their mastery of the situation. McLean had just experienced that violence, and throughout the campaign his confreres would experience much more. Such white-on-white violence raised the troubling possibility that conflict among the state's white men might actually become militarized. Although generations of local political leaders had also led the militia, up until 1860, the militia had never played the kind of military role in politics that had become familiar since secession. For most of that time, moreover, the lines between friend and foe had been drawn with relative ease. Free versus slave, law and order versus abolition, Confederate versus Yankee, white Democrat versus black Republican. Now, both sides, in the leadership as well as the rank and file, included substantial numbers of white Southern men, many of them veterans, from the conflicts of the 1860s and the 1870s. in solidarity with one another, these same white men had constituted a formidable enemy against which both the Federal Army and the black majority had suffered serious losses. But even united, they remained a minority. If the political split now developing within their ranks were to turn bloody, an outcome that recent history made increasingly likely, any victory might also constitute a disastrous, fratricidal defeat for white supremacy. Violence had its practical uses, but so did restraint. The Democratic leadership was hardly willing to write off McLean's white supporters, and so for Tillman and the Red Shirt leadership, the challenge became to intimidate their white opponents without unleashing a wholesale campaign of terror among white men. Harassment followed well-established patterns. Democrats arrived en masse at greenback rallies and sought divisions of time. In Edgefield, they took over such events entirely, slyly promising safe passage to white Republican leader Ellery M. Brayton should he choose to attend his own rally. Sometimes the red shirts did not stop at threatening or humiliating their white rivals. On the 4th of July, a Democratic gunman murdered a white independent former congressional candidate at Camden. But the most serious violence of the campaign followed Cash's efforts to mobilize black supporters in a district outside the traditional Republican low country strongholds. As many as 700 black men and an unspecified number of white men attended Cash's campaign appearance in the town of Lancaster. Members of the audience harassed and perhaps assaulted a Democratic editor who offered a rebuttal. Later that day, white terrorists shot 6 blacks, 4 fatally. It is difficult to piece together from unfriendly sources just what happened or what it meant. It is quite likely, however, that black voters responded with hostility to the Democratic editor and like-minded spokesman. The comparative black political freedom of Reconstruction was only a few years past, and black men had often played assertive roles. In murdering 4 black activists but no white ones, Lancaster's white Democrats apparently chose their targets with care. They might have to negotiate with black power in the Low Country, but if black men became politically active in other areas, white Democratic rule would truly be in jeopardy. By selectively targeting black voters, Democrats might discourage such a movement without creating irreparable rifts among white men. Democratic commentators simultaneously blamed Cash for inspiring violence and claimed such violence as a Democratic prerogative. Democratic violence, they suggested, was always a form of self-defense. Independent biracial action itself constituted an attack on white supremacy, and retribution needed no further justification. At the same time that they sought to shift the blame for the violence to Cash, Democrats could not resist claiming it as their own particular métier. Republicans argued Dawson's paper had realized that the only way to win elections was to have Democrats on their side. The independent coalition knew that Cash stood a chance in the race because he understands how to handle shotguns. The reaction to the Lancaster riot followed the model of earlier white panics. Over the next few days, Democratic papers, including the Charleston News and Courier, broadcast rumors that federal troops would garrison Lancaster and that black mobs were planning to burn the town, and even that 1,500 armed black men under the command of a black North Carolinian were poised for invasion. Regardless of whether the News and Courier's staff had made up the rumors out of the whole cloth or whether this attempt to play on centuries of accumulated anxiety about a slave revolt seemed credible to most readers, the recourse to the trope of armed black insurrection revealed how readily such images still came to mind. As in previous campaigns, Democratic newspapers characterized black voters as a hostile block of anti-democratic sentiment purchasable by cash or false promises by whatever enemies the Democrats might have. A group of scheming white men, they claimed, were using a gullible and monolithic black electorate for their own ends. The strength of the greenback radicals is the strength of the colored vote, as far as the administration hacks and the local leaders can control and direct it, declared a typical article in the News and Courier. The reverse, apparently, was also true. The Republicans would use the greenback challenge as an opportunity to Africanize the state. In this reading, the greenbackers were for sale, and there is no one to buy them but the radicals. To be bought was, at the very least, to be another's political creature, that is, to be dependent and therefore less than a real white man. In its most literal reading, the metaphor likened these purchasable white men to slaves. Democrats sexualized the struggle over political power, suggesting that greenback leaders were encouraging black men's sexual aspirations toward white women. Most white Southern men understood racial power as a zero-sum problem. In the postbellum South, as in revolutionary Haiti, one race or the other would be in control, and if black men entered politics, their goal must be domination. But since control over a household and its dependents formed the basis of white men's claim to independence and citizenship, domination could not be neatly separated into spheres of government and household. Black men's attempts to enter the white male domain of politics could seem to foreshadow attempts to enter and therefore dominate white men's households, particularly their daughters and wives. This was what white supremacists meant when they declared that political equality was synonymous with social equality, or when they accused greenbackers of being political miscegenationists. Such tortured telescoping seemed implausible and forced to some, but for others, these were potent arguments. The personal or familial shame or anxiety some white men felt regarding the sexual abuse of black women made the prospect of such a reversal deeply troubling. Many more, no doubt, feared being unable to protect their dependents from the still powerful stigma of blackness as utter social degradation. South Carolina's independence proved all too vulnerable to such corrosive attacks. Even as greenbackers suffered from their enemies' efforts to sexualize the contest, they also staggered under the burden of their own assumption about the relationship of race and gender to producerism. In ways they did not fully grasp, the history of white manhood shaped and limited the radicals' producerist critique of Southern society. White Southern men had historically controlled both the region's productive resources and the legitimate use of force. Their ideal of producerist manhood as the basis for legitimate rule was rooted literally and figuratively in the history of patriarchal slave-holding republicanism. Even as they sought to forge a coalition of the disaffected that included black men as producers and voters, the history of white solidarity worked against them. An economic critique that equated production with virtue obscured important differences of interest between planters and tenants, and the militant, defiant mobilization they envisioned had historically made black men targets, not allies. Cash revealed some of these tensions when he spoke to audiences of black and white voters. He protested the prosecution of the Negroes by lynch law and their assassination for political opinion. But the history of race, land ownership, and labor relations shaped what followed. Cash appeared to assume that his audience was composed of white employers of black laborers, for his bill of indictment against the Democratic leadership included running the Negro out of the state and no substitute, a charge that would have resonance mainly for planters. this analytical shortcoming would haunt producerist arguments in South Carolina throughout the 1880s and beyond. Violence, intimidation, and fraud earned the Democrats a 4-1 victory over the Greenback Republicans in 1882. In hindsight, Democratic control over the election machinery outside the Low Country all but precluded the possibility of an upset. Sometimes the electoral wheels turned almost too easily. McLean received not a single vote in the up-country county of Anderson, but even where election officials counted ballots with some honesty, it was impossible to determine in precisely what ways the campaign of terror had affected participation. McLean's total reflected the fragmented and unstable basis of his radical challenge. He won only Low Country Beaufort County, where heavy Republican turnout gave him 80% of the vote, and he earned about half that proportion in 2 other Low Country counties. He did poorly throughout the Piedmont, where the white Democratic loyalty, intimidation, and fraud dispatched what little local resistance the Democrats encountered. In Tillman's Edgefield, he earned fewer than 600 votes, or about 15% of the total gubernatorial vote, less than half the number the county cast for Republican congressional nominee Ellery Brayton. But 2 of McLean's 5 strongest totals came in the white majority counties of Chesterfield, where Cash actually outpolled his Democratic congressional opponent, and Okosinee. In Lancaster, interestingly, McLean was only 22% of the vote, but Cash, running on the same ticket, won twice that proportion. Perhaps fraud shaped these unequal totals. Perhaps Cash's manly self-assertion neutralized his biracial alliance in the eyes of otherwise loyal Democratic voters. Or perhaps some combination of black and white voters in that inland district defiantly resisted the Democrats' brazen attack on their citizenship and suffrage. The 1882 defeat fractured the Greenback Republican coalition beyond repair. Fusion agreements collapsed and any trust between the parties evaporated. With the failure of the independent challenge, violence subsided as a concomitant of politics, even in Edgefield. Reporting on an 1884 campaign meeting, a correspondent professed to be dazed with the shock that throughout the day I have not seen a pistol and have only seen one drunken man. A well-attended Republican campaign meeting in Edgefield drew red-shirt observers, but no violence ensued. The local Republicans had become so insignificant that Edgefield Democrats felt that donning their shirts and saddling up sufficed. Ben Tillman was almost certainly one of those observers, for in May 1884 he had been rewarded for his good service in earlier campaigns with a new title, Captain of the Edgefield Hussars. But the red shirts' role was about to change. South Carolina Republicans were battered by local losses as well as setbacks in all branches of the federal government. The U.S. Supreme Court effectively overturned the 1875 Civil Rights Act in 1883, and Democrats retook the White House in the election of 1884. After that year, Republicans ceased running statewide tickets. In the absence of a continuing Republican presence in upcountry politics, the rifle clubs turned militia units became social groups. The Hussars, for example, held a popular annual picnic at their clubhouse. The campaign of 1876 had already begun to glow golden in historical memory. An 1884 Edgefield demonstration featured a Hampton and Gary banner from 1876, which had been faithfully preserved by a local militia leader who regards it as a sacred treasure. Even the Hamburg Massacre could become the stuff of an advertisement as a merchant hawking his wares in an Edgefield paper opened with a pitch guaranteed to bring the red shirts to mind. The greatest excitement prevails, screamed the headline. Augusta, the scene of the struggle. But this struggle concerned his uniquely inexpensive clothing, not the fate
of White Supremacy. The history of white manhood had established that no movement for reform could safely look to the black majority for aid. White supremacy had become the sine qua non of statewide political action, but the issues that had threatened to fracture the Democrats in 1882 had not gone away. It remained unclear how many local and regional splits among white voters could be mended, especially in the absence of a credible Republican opposition. In the Low Country, accommodationist arrangements only partly neutralized the region's large black majorities. There, Democrats continued to fear the resurgence of black Republican assertiveness, which for them recalled the white victims of Low Country Reconstruction clashes. In the Upcountry, however, where black South Carolinians had relatively little political strength, some white voters had responded to the charge that the state Democratic Party and the government it controlled had not acted in their interests. White political dominance had been only provisionally secured against McLean and Russell's alliance of the disaffected. The heart of the problem remained the Redeemers' inability to address the persistent crisis in agriculture. At the end of 1885, as the legislature once again debated repealing the lien law, a correspondent noted with apprehension that the farmers in his area had barely made it through the year and lacked the cash to buy supplies. When the legislature revised the lien law, making liens for supplies inferior to landlords' liens for rent and laborers' liens for wages, Dawson worried publicly that this would put serious difficulties in the way of the large body of small farmers who rent their farms and who are not in condition to farm without help until the next crop comes in. His Charleston paper identified with the state's merchants, but its editor understood that the state's fragile political order might be radically imperiled by a wholly alienated yeomanry. A similar spirit of anxiety led the Edgefield Advertiser to publish the bitter complaint of a farmer who excoriated a class of farmers who want to control the laboring classes and reduce all farming in South Carolina to the boss system of agriculture. In terms of recalling other opponents of landed aristocrats, this man presented himself as the voice of a disenfranchised mass whose very freedom was threatened by arrogant elitists whose politics amounted to slavery for the poor. The tenant system, according to their gospel, must be broken up, and they proposed to accomplish this by impoverishing the small farmers, white and black, and depriving them of the means of getting credit, and starving them into the condition of dependents and hirelings and subjects and slaves. Will the repeal of the lien law bring about the condition of things that the revolutionists hope to accomplish? It ought not to require a moment's reflection to see that it will not. Slavery cannot be reestablished. We must build up new systems. It is not statesmanship to degrade and impoverish the laboring classes. Here, even after Greenbacker's defeat, were divisions of class that could overshadow differences of race, a call for new approaches to agriculture and labor, an appeal to men's pride in their independence and suspicion of the motives of the rich and powerful. Here was a hostility to aristocrats that offered a potentially powerful weapon against the coastal and urban elite, but also perhaps a weapon against local big men. It remained unclear, though, what role the political descendants of Gary and McLean would play in shaping and directing these continuing grievances. Gary's assertive white manhood and legislative proposals had generated enthusiasm, but he had failed to break into the party's inner circle. McLean's biracial producerism had run up against the guns of white men and the history of white manhood, but the problems he identified
and the economic critique he offered would continue to resonate. Ben Tillman had been present at each of the major turning points that had created this threatening new white discontent. Between 1876 and 1884, he not only had become a successful planner, militia captain, and local Democratic figure, but also had helped officiate at the shotgun wedding of white supremacy and reform, insisting that the pursuit of good government must take place only through the channels of the white-only Democratic Party. He was also heir to the traditions of sectional hostility and red shirt rebellion. Beginning in the mid-1880s, he set out to channel his white neighbors' anger into a movement that would protect white supremacy by asserting a particular vision of white male producerism, one that would leave Hampton and his followers almost as helpless as it had left McLean. Context of White Supremacy. We will start on Chapter 4, Clean Ending, for the first audio segment. So we'll pick up on Chapter 4 if anyone is reading and following along. Context of White Supremacy. Feel free to chime in if you would like to share anything on what you heard from our first segment. The number to dial is 760-569-7676. The code is 564-943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. That number again is 760-569-7676. The code is 564-943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. If you do not want to use your phone, you can use the free Flash player. It works anywhere in the world. All you have to do is linked at Black Talk Radio Network, but if you need the address, it is tiny, TINY.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. So that address one more time, tiny, TINY.cc/1 race, and that is the number 1. When you do so, you'll see the link on the left side of the page. It says free flash phone. Click it. It will open a small window on your screen. The top line, it is a drop-down menu. Select the number that I just gave out, which again is 760-569-7676. On the next line, it will ask for the code. That code again is 564-943. Final line, it will ask for a name, whatever you're comfortable with. If you are cool with your real name, that's fine. You can press random keys. You can use a nickname, whatever. Once you get all that entered, click the green button. It will connect you to the live program. You should be able to hear us. Same procedure. If you would like to participate, you should see the dial pad on your screen. Press star 6. When you do so, you'll hear the audio prompt. It'll tell you to press 1. Do that. I will see your hand on the screen, and we'll get you on the line. Again, you can also feel free to email if you have any notes, concerns for folks who are listening to the archives. Real quick, just before I get to callers, this came out today. Clemson officially denounces Pitchfork Ben, a racist founder of the school. I'm not going to read the whole report, but in part it reads, Clemson University's Board of Trustees officially denounced one of the public South Carolina schools' founders, Benjamin Tillman, in a resolution passed Friday. Clemson had been pressured to stop honoring Tillman in the aftermath of the June killing of 9 people at a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. The resolution is passed unanimously. One of the main buildings on campus is named for Tillman, a white supremacist who openly advocated and celebrated the killing of black people and who was also a founding trustee of the university. His nickname was Pitchfork Ben, and he served as both a South Carolina governor and U.S. senator. The views of Benjamin Tillman are repugnant to our values and our fundamental purpose, the trustees' resolution states. It goes on to call for a task force of students, staff, faculty, and alumni to determine how to best preserve and tell the complete history of Clemson. Tillman is considered instrumental in founding Clemson University as a late 19th century politician. Clemson is named for Thomas G. Clemson, son-in-law of John C. Calhoun. In his will, Clemson named Tillman as a lifetime trustee for the school. However, the Board of Trustees resolution conceded that recent events in our state and nationally have prompted concerns, including from Clemson faculty leaders. The resolution stated Benjamin Tillman was also known to be, by his own admission, an ardent racist and led a campaign of terror against African Americans in South Carolina that included intimidation and violence, of which he boasted about publicly. And for some members of our university family, Benjamin Tillman's legacy included not only contributions to Clemson University, but also oppression, terror, and hate. I will stop there. You can read the rest, but this just came out today, reported hours before we went live. Still unfolding down in South Carolina. Folks have any thoughts they would like to share? Folks who chimed in with a hand up, line should be open. Feel free to chime in. Let's see, we should have Mr. Demery, line open, should be with us, and I will nab other hands as I see folks. Mr. Demery, any thoughts stood out? Anything you want to share?
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus. Greetings to the other callers. I think that I have a pretty good understanding from the last reading where they were getting into the lien laws and the stock laws. I think that these men like Bill Tillman and other planners and former slave owners, had a degree of wealth, so they desired power. So in order to gain this power, they used the political process. And then through these different events, like the lien law and the stock law, they gained the support of the so-called commoners, where in actuality they were looking out for their own best benefit. And then with the crop lien situation, you get into sharecropping, where, basically that was just another form of slavery, because even a tenant farmer or sharecropper would not have any benefits. He would have to give up a portion of his crops would go to two people, the landowner and also the millman that was set up. And so when the millman got set up in the process, the landowners started to get discouraged because they couldn't take a larger share. So anyway, that's the way that's going, and it plays out even later on in the chapter, because you just keep going over and over with class division. But basically, what's coming down to is just white against black, and then white oppressing black and keeping us down economically. The system of white supremacy, part of their tactics is the little or no appreciation shown or expressed towards others, and they taking credit for everything. Their riches were gained on the backs of black people, and they're constantly oppressing and putting blacks down. There was a great emphasis put on white lies on page 92 when they talked about McKee Merriweather, excuse me, who was the sole white man that was killed during the Hamburg Massacre. And when they started to mention Martin Gray, Gray used the memory of this white man, for political gain, and saying that holding the guy up as an emblem of virtual white manhood. And they even considered erecting a monument for this sole casualty of white casualty, although there were several other black men, none of their names was mentioned in, and the black lives are devalued in the system of white supremacy. So Martin Gray, another ardent racist, was not in favor of state-funded tax because it would give proceeds to educate blacks. You know, it's interesting that the same strategy with the lien law, stock law, and all this other stuff politically going on in South Carolina was going on in Mississippi about the same time, you know, with the Mississippi Plan. But it just shows the collaboration, you know, between these races, regardless of what state. Because only in a system of white supremacy can two generals from an opposing side be elected to serve in public office and then get to be senators. Where this Martin Gray believed that, racial coexistence could only exist in domination and terror. And that's what the system of white supremacy looks like. And that's what it means to be white, is dominating and terrorizing black people. Wade Hampton ended up stopping Martin Gray's career because they were opposed to each other. And it's like Mr. Fuller said, they may argue about how to practice racism, but they both agree that racism needs to exist, and we need to oppress black people. They used the black vote, manipulated it, promising black voters certain things, but they didn't intend to give them anything in the first place. I noticed that the author used the word self-assertion, or the straight outs, to replace for white supremacy. And I noticed a lot of outright political corruption and voter fraud taking place. And I have a few more comments, but I'll reserve those for a little later. Thanks for taking the call. I'll give somebody else a chance.
Right on. Appreciate the feedback once again from Mr. Demery 4. If other folks would like to chime in, feel free. Press *6 if you have anything to share. I don't know if lack of commentary from other folks listening in means that they didn't find much constructive value this week, or maybe they were distracted from paying attention. It is, as I said again, reading in the middle of the summer, to be reading history from 150 years ago is probably not the most entertaining thing, but certainly I hope is giving folks a better grasp of everything that has played out in South Carolina over the past 30 days. 30 days to the day. One thing I will say before I get to some of my comments, the article that I referenced, the young black male in South Carolina, Emmanuel Christopher, there was just a pretty lengthy article written about him in the Atlantic. He's in South Carolina. He unfortunately got a white girl pregnant, Cowbell, and she and her mom lied and all this other stuff. The mom called him a nigger and to his face, allegedly, and all this other stuff to steal this child. At any rate, they were talking, and I believe it was the black male. He lived on Wade Hampton Drive, I think it was, down in South Carolina, which just, again, brought it all home for me. So we take the Confederate flag down, and now we have 9,999 monuments to white supremacy as opposed to 1,000, or whatever the number happens to be. But I thought that was interesting. Some of my other comments before I get to the phone line. I think right at the end there, right, we just concluded chapter 3. That would definitely be one for me. The paragraph, I guess this is the second to last paragraph on 109, where he says, here, even after the Greenbackers' defeat, were divisions of class that could overshadow differences of race, a call for new approaches to agriculture and labor, and appeal to men's pride in their independence. And I'll stop there. Absolutely. White people, I never dispute that. White people argue with one another. Certainly you have a pecking order in the system of white supremacy. Some white women have a lot more power than other white women. Same for white males. Absolutely true. However, that does not in any way obscure or minimize the fact that regardless, the most powerful person, the most powerful white person, the least powerful white person, they are in agreement and a part of the same army in support of white supremacy. That is important. And when he says that these class differences overshadow differences of race, I do not believe that that is true. And I have not in this book bumped into any evidence that would suggest that that is true, that there were white people, certainly not a significant number. And I mean, I've only heard a handful mentioned here or there. Joe Cruz, one white guy, he said went to defend with guns, defend black lives, and white people killed him. But I haven't heard a whole lot of white people who are saying, forget this white supremacy stuff, man. I'm trying to, because there's a majority black population in this state. I'm trying to go link up with these black folks and, see if we can get things straight, get some of these laws repealed, these lien laws, and hook things up. So I haven't seen much evidence of that at all. I have seen a lot of disputes where white people are arguing with each other about how things are going to be run, but I just haven't seen any evidence that these little disputes and things that white people are having with each other that are even leading to violence sometimes, that those are overshadowing or trumping the most dominant force on the planet, and that's white supremacy, racism. If I'm incorrect, let me know. I definitely have to star this point because the author of this text might be coming on the program later in the summer. He's supposed to be going out of the country, but he indicated he might be willing to come chat it up with us when he gets back. So that would definitely be a point of contention, and I would even assert might be an act of racism deliberately on his part. One of the other points, and it also, I guess it's right there related, yes, white people will fight with one another. They have arguments and what have you, and white people will mistreat other white people if it will get at black people. And I thought that was phenomenal, just that whole scene where they're talking about the voter registration, right, which sounded similar to some of the things that people are talking about right now. But when they brought this up, and they're saying, well, yeah, if we do this, we might mess over some white people. We might mess it up, and some of the white people might not be able to vote. And it was just like, well, whatever is going to maintain white supremacy. Like if we can put it in to make it a little bit better, we can help out a white person here or there. So if they come and they can't read the information on the ballot, we can give them a little help and tell them the correct box to put their vote in and all that. But as long as it's going to mess over mostly black people, it's all good. We might have a few reservations if we think that this might slide off the rails and really mess it up for some white people. But as long as it's mostly just going to jam up black people, we're all good. A few white sacrifices along the way, that's just a part of the business that we've chosen. You see, I wanted to pick out some of the specifics on, that was 104, where they're kind of running down this dispute about who's going to be able to vote and what have you. Let's see, this is 104 and 102. If it takes me more than a second to pick out the highlight, I'll just pick one of our callers. That'll give me a second to nab it. Oh, is this? No, this is not the correct one. All right. Our caller at 2564, you should be with us as well. Do you have a question, comment you want to get in?
Hello, Gus. This is Shadow.
Oh, greetings. Good to hear from you, sir.
Good. Yes, I've been following this book. I've been reading on my own, and one of the important points that I read that you just read right now, when he said, I'm paraphrasing, that politics was not about excuse the word, fair government, but it was about racial superiority. I thought that was a very important line, and I think that that's still true today. I think this book definitely it lets you understand the politics of what's going on today when you read it, even though it's 150 years old.
I think so as well. I think you see a lot of those same tropes played out right now. One could even argue that what's happening with Donald Trump right now and all of his popularity is very similar to Ben Tillman, some of the things that he's outlining in this book right now. The passage I was thinking, it was the bottom of 97, where I was talking about the new voter registration law and saying that it might disenfranchise some of them where they're not able to vote, and it seems that a significant number of white people did have concerns about this. But he says, Butler publicly worried that white voters might be disenfranchised by the law. No nervous regard for consistency, fretted the Charleston News and Courier, should prevent the legislature from abolishing registration if it can be ascertained that registration will lessen the political power of the white people. Direct quote. And I feel like that's exactly it. Like, let's just be clear about what we're trying to do. As long as we're going to be able to dominate, do that. Like, forget trying to make sure that we appear consistent and legitimate. As long as white people are in charge and we're increasing our power, that's what we're supposed to be doing. Like, forget all that by any means necessary. Whatever needs to be done, and we need to go back and change it and tweak something, then whatever we need to do, let's make sure it happens. And it turns out that them doing this, it did, as he said, depress the vote. It did seem like some white people were not able to vote. For me, on 104, where they talked about the assertiveness of black males. I guess they went to one of these meetings. They were talking about these are black Republicans. And they went to a meeting. Make sure I have it right here. Time pieced together. This is why it shows their targets with care. Okay, yeah, here we go. Most of the serious violence of the campaign followed Cash's efforts to mobilize black supporters in a district outside the traditional Republican Lowcountry strongholds. As many as 700 black men and an unspecified number of white men attended Cash's campaign appearance in the town of Lancaster. Members of the audience harassed and perhaps assaulted a Democratic editor who offered a rebuttal. Later that day, white terrorists shot 6 blacks, 4 fatally. It's difficult to piece together from unfriendly sources just what happened or what it meant. I thought that was fascinating as well. Again, as I've said, all of these narratives that black people are cowards and don't do anything and don't stand up to white people, that is simply not true. I think this is not the first example in this text alone that we've had of black people being assertive, standing up for themselves, even armed black men. We had the reports from last week and before about black militias that were trying to protect black lives in South Carolina as best they could. But this, again, violent repression of any notion, any idea of black self-defense, black self-respect, and black people saying that we're not going to be afraid, that we are not intimidated and cowered by white terrorism. I think he also talked in this section about this consistent idea of being able to mobilize white people behind this idea that there is some Negro menace that black people are mobilizing to storm and invade South Carolina from North Carolina, and that we're just under present danger. I think that notion, definitely you still see that anxiety that white people can whip up in a second with regards to black people. You definitely still see that played out. Whether it's true, whether it's not true, it just seems that that's one that can easily get white people worked up to participate in any sort of brutality against black people. Yeah, I mean, this is crazy when I say, well, I shouldn't say, I'm sorry, it's not crazy, it's predictable racist behavior, where it says over the next few days, Democratic papers, including the Charleston News and Courier, broadcast rumors that federal troops would garrison Lancaster, that black mobs were planning to burn the town, and even 1,500 armed black men under command of a black North Carolinian were poised for invasion. Just being able to make these sort of comments and have little to no evidence, and you can mobilize and get white people to act on that is incredible, and that is absolutely absolutely still in effect today, in my opinion. The knockout game, if folks remember. The last one, I had one more on page 106. Let's see. Let's see. And one more on page 4, bottom of 106. Sorry, bottom of 106. Might take me a few moments. I have a used copy of the book, and I'm not a snob. I have no problem with used copies. It's just that it has highlights in it, so it's throwing me off a little bit because I'm looking, thinking, oh, that's where I'm marking. And it's like, no, that's not not marked. So it might take me oh yeah, on top of, how could I forget, cowbell. So this is top of 106, where it says, even when united, they remained a minority. If the political split now developing within their ranks were to turn bloody, and this is white people feuding amongst themselves, an outcome of equality was synonymous with social equality, or when they accused greenbackers of being political miscegenationists. Such tortured telescoping seemed implausible and forced to some, but for others there were potent arguments. The personal or familial shame or anxiety some white men felt regarding the sexual abuse of black women made the prospect of such a reversal deeply troubling. That right there. All of it, in addition to the way to attack other white men. I thought that was fascinating in both accounts. The way that you attack other white men is to say that they're not really white, that they're kind of effeminate, to emasculate them, that they can't defend themselves, that they cannot adequately practice and utilize violence in the maintenance of white power. I thought that was interesting, and or to just attack them and say that they're trying to make it easier for these niggas to have our white daughters or white wives or whatever the case may be. I thought that was fascinating, but that sentence specifically, I thought that was a curious way of writing about the history of white men raping black females and black children and black males. But I thought that was a very curious way of writing it. The personal or familial shame or anxiety some white men felt regarding the sexual abuse of black women made the prospect of such a reversal deeply troubling. And I'm not sure that white men have a lot of shame, personal or familial, about raping black females, males, or children. I'm not sure how much personal or familial anxiety they have about all of this either. To me, I thought that was, as I'll say again, a curious wording of that phenomenon of rape. Maybe that's just me. Anything else stood out from folks listening in?
Yes, I'd like to comment on page 101, where let's see if I can find it. It said the Democrats should not ignore white men's grievances, and Negro rule would be worse than anything, and would make all other reform impossible. The only safe course for those who oppose the stock law and other policies, such as the registration law, was to hold together for white supremacy. And after it is securely won, we will fight all our other grievances. So that shows that first they want to get one thing straight, like you said before. We want to preserve white supremacy, and then we'll deal with these other grievances. I also wanted to say that individual crimes that was committed by white men were hidden under the context of a mob or a mob mentality. And in the middle of page 104, when Cash was he was aligning himself with the Greenbackers and some of the Republicans that included black people, so that he could get the vote. But as he was talking, when he was talking and he was making a speech, and he said something about running the Negroes out of the state. I thought that was 104. Anyway, he was aligning himself with blacks politically, and then in his speech started, he was backing a bill that would, I guess, eventually, here we go, that was on 106. It said Cash revealed some of these tensions when he spoke to an audience of black and white voters. He protested the persecution of the Negroes by the lynch law and their assassination for political opinion. But the history of race, land ownership, and labor relations shaped what followed. Cash appeared to assume that his audience was composed of white employers of black labor, but his bill of indictment against the Democratic leadership included running a Negro out of the state and no substitute, a charge that would have resonated mainly for Flannery. I thought it was interesting that, he would, they're hypocrites anyway, because anything that they promise black people, they don't plan to carry this out. And so that's all I have.
All the other folks that dialed in with a hand up should be with us as well.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Okay, all right. Well, it's not much, but I have always said, even though people, have no hope for politics at all, and I don't have that much either, but I am working with the idea that it's just better instead of like the Green Party is gone. What are the Greenbacks? The Greenbacks are gone. Nobody ever heard of them. The major political parties were Republicans and Democrats. The Greenbacks have come and gone. And I have always said that if you are going to wrest power, the best thing to do is just hijack something else. If you want to wrest power in the United States, you just hijack somebody else's party, and that's what the Tea Party did. They just hijacked the Republican Party, and I think that instead of working with Democrats and all this other stuff, you should just hijack the party. I mean, I think that would be much more effective, but that's just me. If you're too poor, you need to get somewhere. You're going to need a vehicle, and if you're too poor to buy your own vehicle, just hijack someone else's and take it where you want it to go. But I mean, that's just the way I feel about it. So it gives you a recognizable point to start from. But I would like to hear what do you think? I mean, I think all these little parties go away. Just the main parties persist because white people allow it to persist. But why not hijack it for your own purposes?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, greetings to Gus T Renegade, and I agree with the previous speaker. They hijacked everything. They hijacked America, and they hijacked the planet. So you're absolutely right. They repeat that process ad infinitum. And this whole process of learning about the history of the Democratic Party and looking at what the Republican Party has become today, I don't know how black people even participate in the system at all. Like I just can't comprehend it because, the origins of both parties are just so evil and just so corrupt and just so wicked and white supremacist. There are no choices for us. And just the whole voting process, everything about it is just so corrupt and racist that I don't know how we even participate in this system at all. But there was something that I found very poignant on page 105. It said, Democrats sexualized the struggle over political power, suggesting that Greenback leaders were encouraging black men's sexual aspirations towards white women. Most Southern men understood racial power as a zero-sum problem. In the post-Southern South, as in revolutionary Haiti, one race or the other would be in control. And if black men entered politics, their goal must be domination. But since control over a household and its dependents formed the basis of white men's claim to independence and citizenship, domination could not be neatly separated into the spheres of government, and household. Black men's attempts to enter the white male domain of politics could seem to foreshadow attempts to enter and therefore dominate white men's households, and particularly their daughters and wives. White people are the greatest projectors I have ever seen. Every psychopathological behavior, thought, and action that they have ever done to any other living group on the planet, they put it off on black people. all of them are whites, but even most intensely on black people. And when they talk about the sexualizing political power, it kind of goes back to, in my opinion, when they talk about that, sexualizing the struggle over political power, it's almost like they're suggesting the same erotic pleasure that they garner from mistreating, abusing, and killing black people, that black people would get from participating in their politics. And, of course, they're equating politics to also their females. So we want to dominate them in bed, no different than we want to dominate them in politics. So everything about what they say and do is just the sickest form of projection and propaganda to basically put all of their behaviors and psychopathologies in non-white people, and most intensely black people. It's just sick. It's just sick. I find that particular paragraph to be very telling about that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating little read. It just the savageness. Like anytime that white people try and say that black people are uncouth and criminal and all this, you've got like this is governors and politicians are like dueling and killing one another, and like Ben Tillman got censored for having a fist fight while he was I don't remember if it was in the Congress or the Senate, but he got censored. I guess he was a U.S. Senator, so it probably would have been during his tenure as Senator. But when they try and talk like they're, refined, and that's part of the reason that they've been able to do all of this, because they exemplify civilization and democracy and decorum. I mean, that is nonsense of the highest order. Just this whole time period, which is not that long ago, this whole time period, just the way that they're conducting themselves is amazing. You've just got riots at the drop of a dime, white people going to kill other white people because I don't like what you said about my wife, or ready to kill another white person because I don't like what you said about my wife. It is fascinating. Also, just real quick before we have about, or I guess less than 10, about probably 8 minutes before we get to the second segment, if anybody else has anything else that they want to get in. A lot of these quotes and things where they're able to go back and get what the person said and what have you. A lot of this stuff is in old newspapers. Just again, the importance, you'd be surprised, check in and the type of things that people are saying that get quoted in the papers and what have you. So definitely keeping track of what is going on to make sure that you are informed. Let's see. Check, make sure anything else stood out. Yeah, just it seemed to me, at least, just in that whole vein, because you're still having duels and what have you in this section, and there's been quite a bit of violence in addition to the Civil War and enslavement of black people and terrorism. But it's just there's been a lot of violence, even white on white violence, white on white crime. Just that this system requires, it demands violence. I think, to me at least, that is important in terms of how that can end up being a liability, which I think you see today. I think today it's been revised, if you will, to where it's, well, this person is soft on crime, or this person is soft on terrorism, and you just want to let Al Qaeda and ISIL or Iran or whoever the threat happens to be, you just want to let them walk all over us. Putin and Russia, you just let them walk all over us, and we're not going to stand up and show the world that we're the toughest. I think that is why that right there can be grounds for an attack, for impugning your whiteness, if you will, if you're not willing to go out and handle these niggers and do what needs to be done. And if that means killing somebody, beating somebody down, whatever it means, any form of violence, justified, accepted, that you're not willing to do that you're not man enough, you're not woman enough, you're not white enough to do what needs to be done. I'm not surprised at all that could be a critique that you see in this book. And as I said, I think you see that play all the way up 2015. Just gonna check. Anybody? Anything else they wanted to make sure they get in? Last 5 minutes.
Gus?
Yes, sir.
It's really interesting because reading this book, and I just started reading The Heart of Whiteness by Robert Jensen, and to me, Ben Tillman, the book about Ben Tillman really brings home the system and how individuals function in the system towards the great end of perpetuating white supremacy. And from what I've read thus far in Robert Jensen's book, he speaks about it on a very individual level, just breaking down his own feelings and the things that he has experienced, and it's just so telling about just the average white person, how they think, and I apply it to white males and white females as well. But I just find that to be a very interesting thing to be reading that book and reading this one at the same time. I would suggest, if anyone doesn't have that book, The Heart of Whiteness by Robert Jensen, get your hands on it.
Hey, James, can you hear me?
Yes.
James?
Did you have a question, ma'am?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I got confused on my calls. I'm so sorry.
Mm-hmm. Right on.
I wanted to briefly mention something about that duel. It was interesting that when it comes to whites killing each other, then this calls for some serious debate, and then that even resulted into a division among political views, all behind a white man's death. But, it just still points to the high emphasis that they put on white life and then the devaluation of black life. I'm mute.
Absolutely. And I think he had a great passage in where he talked about how violence against black people didn't really need to be justified or authorized. Pretty much anything would validate terrorism against black people. I definitely think that's still in effect as well. It's more of this is going to come as we get into Chapter 4. I know last week it stood out. I think they used the term sun-browned goddesses to refer to white women who had to go out and work in the fields, on the farms, what have you, for white landowners. That term is going to come up again, and their role in all of this. I guess that is one thing that I would say this book is really, really focused on white men, and for this time period, I can understand that. I guess that would be the only thing that I would say, that over the last 150 years, there has been a radical shift in the role and importance of white women, where they are greatly minimized in terms of what they are doing and all this. Although they are going to pop up next chapter. Keep listening. We're picking up on Chapter 4. Unless somebody had anything they can get in like 60 seconds, we will go ahead and get started. Anybody have anything they can get in 60 seconds? Great. I assume folks are all satisfied. If you were listening and didn't call in to get a hand up or what have you, and something stood out that you wanted to comment on, just write it down. We should have ample time to share once the second audio segment concludes. We're picking up on Chapter 4. For me, it's on page 100, and we will be back once the second audio I don't know. The person, did you have something quick that you wanted to get in before we get to the second audio segment? If you can get it in quickly. The caller at 8562, did you have something quickly you needed to get in?
No, I started listening late. I want to hear the second part first before I comment.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Right on. We will get cracking with the second audio component, Context of White Supremacy. This is Stephen Kantrowitz, Ben Tillman, and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, audio segment number 2. Chapter 4, Farmers, Dudes, White Negroes, and the Sun-Browned Goddess.
Barely a month after Tillman's elevation to the rank of captain of the Edgefield Hussars, he and other local farmers met at the militia unit's pavilion to establish a farmers club, the Edgefield Agricultural and Mechanical Society. During the summer and fall of 1884, Tillman emerged as the sustaining force behind this effort to organize the leading agriculturalists, farmers, and businessmen for the promotion of agriculture and for the development of the business interests and resources of the Edgefield County that are connected with and kindred to agriculture. Tillman helped frame the group's constitution, spoke at its meetings, and in 1885 became its president. That August, he attended the joint convention of the State Agricultural Society and Grange in Bennettsville, where he gave a provocative speech outlining his vision for the uplift of South Carolina's white farmers. At Bennettsville and beyond, Tillman posited an identity of interest among the farmers, by which he meant the state's white male heads of agricultural households. Whiteness, maleness, and productive labor together made these people the state's legitimate citizenry, but in Tillman's view, their prosperity and independence had been jeopardized by the actions of less worthy rivals. White farmers' enemies included black men who aspired to economic or political independence, but the most immediate threat came from the powerful white men, the Redeemer leadership Tillman branded an aristocracy, and the rising mercantile and industrial class. As a slogan, white supremacy called for the political unity of white men, but Tillman did not believe that aristocrats and merchants, properly counted as white men for their personal and economic behavior, made them the enemies of the farmers, redrawing the circle of legitimate political and economic authority to include the farmers and to exclude all who opposed their interests. Tillman began to argue that only certain white men were truly white and truly men. Many, it seemed, had become so tainted by their association with blacks or their unproductive livelihoods that they had forfeited their right to govern. Yet govern they did, and farmers paid the price. Tillman feared that political impotence and economic deprivation would bring another insurgency like the Greenback Republican Challenge, and he sought to forge an alternative. As the Edgefield Advertiser had been warning since 1878, grinding poverty and an unresponsive leadership might again drive white men to make alliances with black Republicans, sooner or later returning the state to the horrors of Reconstruction misrule. White supremacy needed to become more than a reactionary slogan. If racial hierarchy and white male independence were to survive, far-sighted white men would have to rally the state's authentic citizens around their common interests. The farmers would have to assert their right to act collectively, for only a disciplined martial mobilization like that of 1876 could save them from poverty and subordination to other white men. Together, they could reconstruct their relationship to their party, their government, their lands, and each other, and forge a state government that protected white agricultural households rather than colluding in their destruction. Beginning in the mid-1880s, Tillman sought to reshape the Democratic Party from within, making it the vehicle for rather than the target of white protest. In rhetoric that fused the defiant white male supremacy of Martin Gary with the producerist doctrine of the Greenbacks, he attacked the Democratic Party's leaders as aristocrats who were either unwilling or unable to foster agricultural renewal. This assault rallied a broad coalition of agricultural reformers, opponents of state spending, advocates of increased upcountry representation, and the poorly organized legions of those with grievances against the Redeemer government, as they came together to complain and collaborate, first in local clubs and then in the county and state conventions. a rebellion coalesced within the Democratic Party known variously as the Farmers Association, the Farmers Movement, or the Reform Movement. More and more, as Tillman became known as the state's agricultural Moses, it was simply called the Tillman Movement. At the outset, the Charleston News and Courier uneasily noted a nervousness and restlessness in the Democratic Party which may become dangerous. But Tillman considered his agitation an act of far-sighted statesmanship, a safety valve, so to speak, for the Democratic Party that would protect the party of white unity by providing a white supremacist alternative to class-based interracial radicalism. Tillman called for a variety of state-level reforms, most notably the creation of a college for white farmers, but he held the attention of the state's voters by making incessant attacks on the Redeemer leadership. These unmanly, unproductive urban aristocrats, he charged, hardly embodied the kind of white manhood that could lead the Commonwealth through troubled times. They constituted a corrupt ring standing between the farmers and prosperity, not so very different from the incompetent black men and nefarious white men who had led during Reconstruction. The victims of these attacks responded that Tillman neither represented the common man nor offered him substantive relief, and they were at least partly right. Although Tillman claimed to be the champion and representative of the farmers, his understanding of agricultural poverty was quite limited, and he suspected that most white men, even his farmers, lacked the independence of mind of true citizens. But Tillman's Democratic opponents shared these limitations, and their platform offered disgruntled white farmers even less than Tillman's largely symbolic reforms. In fact, their outraged rebuttals of his attacks backfired, helping distinguish Tillman from the Democratic leadership and substantiating his assertion that they regarded most farming men as their social and political inferiors. Tillman could not have asked for more. In denouncing him as a disreputable demagogue and derisively identifying his speech, dress, and manner as those of a poor white man, Tillman's opponents ironically helped the Edgefield planter established himself as a representative of the white Southern common man. In 1890, when Tillman moved to take over the Democratic Party, disgruntled Low Country leaders mounted an independent challenge and called for black Republican support. Facing opponents who proved to be haughty men and fair-weather white supremacists, Tillman was elected governor by a wide margin. But Tillman's victory had come in part through the organizational energy of the Farmers Alliance, which had arrived in the state as Tillman's movement was floundering in the late 1880s. In the early 1890s, Tillman faced a challenge from that group's more radical leaders who promoted a far more activist agenda, including cooperatives, boycotts, and ultimately political and economic plans of national scope. Tillman feared reforms that went too far, especially those that might require federal intervention or were otherwise reminiscent of Reconstruction. Tillman was instrumental in the defeat of third-party politics in the state, but his victory was not simply a matter of parliamentary or rhetorical tactics. Rather, it represented a strategic victory, the culmination of nearly 2 decades of political work. Together, the legacies of 1876 and 1890 help explain why South Carolina, despite its flourishing Farmers Alliance, produced virtually no populist movement. Since Reconstruction, men like Tillman had helped establish the limits of insurgent politics. They had read or run white dissidents out of the ranks of real white men and had defined federal intervention in local affairs like biracial politics as a return to the ever more lurid horrors of Reconstruction. By 1890, the Red Shirt campaign of 1876 had become the essence of white democratic virtue, and Tillman's efforts to diffuse class conflict among white men through the limited assertion of state power seemed to constitute a reasonable middle ground between the vision of over-ambitious radicals and the presumption
of bourbon aristocrats, building on the political, military, and rhetorical victories he had won over the previous decade, as well as on the limitations of the radicals' own vision. Tillman managed to defuse this challenge and keep South Carolina safely Democratic. From the perspective of the early 1890s, this might have seemed an almost unaccountable short-circuiting of populism's radical possibilities, seen through the wider lens of Tillman's life and career. However, this defeat represented the victory of Tillman's vision of white manhood. Farmers and others. In the years after his speech at Bennettsville, Tillman sketched a portrait of conflict between the farmers and their enemies. This juxtaposition of honest citizens and contemptible others usually took the form of an attack, and between 1885 and 1887, Tillman's constant skirmishes with state officials brought him a level of statewide attention that his modest proposals alone would not have received. Before we turn to his organizational practice, therefore, we ought to meet him, as most South Carolinians did during this period, as an increasingly skillful rhetorician, deftly playing the expectations of producerism, patriarchy, and white male solidarity against the status quo. Tillman's farmers were producers, employers, husbands, and fathers. They were the common people who redeemed the state from radical rule, the real Democrats and white men, in whose hands political authority properly belonged. White women and African Americans had legitimate, although quite different, roles to play in this white man's world, whereas white merchants, lawyers, and other urban men owed their livelihoods to the men who produced the society's real wealth. As C. Van Woodard has noted, the word farmer is laden with ambiguities that have made it a convenient disguise for a variety of interests. In tying legitimate authority to race, occupation, and gender, Tillman celebrated white farming men's individual and collective mastery while attempting to evade or elide questions of class difference among them. This was not always simple. Before the war, Tillman claimed in an 1886 article, the land-owning farmers were the salt of the earth and called no man master. As he wrote those words, he himself owned over 1,600 acres, making him a wealthy farmer by any standard. His own activism, he later claimed, had begun after overextension, and a few bad years in the early 1880s left him in debt and forced him to sell several hundred acres. But many white male agricultural workers had never been land-owning farmers. Before the war or since, as tenants or laborers, they had subsisted at the margins of the planters' and yeomen's worlds. As he refined his vision, Tillman sought to muffle or absorb such tensions. White men's landlessness and indebtedness did not mean that the ideal was faulty, but that something had gone seriously awry. He laid blame for white farmers' growing hardship on their granting black laborers too much autonomy, being indebted to merchants, and thereby falling under the sway of the corporate and financial money power. Their fundamental mistake, however, was in allowing themselves to be governed by selfish, incompetent, and corrupt aristocrats. When Tillman began speaking to audiences in 1885 and 1886, he painted a grim picture of the economic state of white farming households. Even without counting Negroes, at least half of the vast agricultural majority had to borrow money to plant, which meant resorting to liens or mortgages. But it was easier to get into debt than to get out of it, and farmers grew dependent on agricultural credit until, like the opium eater, they cannot quit if they would. Every year, farmers slipped deeper and deeper into debt to predatory merchants and finally into a humiliating, hopeless servitude. Tillman told an upcountry crowd that we want to get from under the lien law, where it forces men to run to the merchants with their hats in their hands and ask, "Is the lien law opened yet?" He denounced the merchants and bankers who have got rich on the poor man. He sought to distinguish between farmers who also acted as merchants and true farmers such as himself. Merchants and servants of corporate interests extracted a living from the productive labor of others. They could make money whether it rains or not. I had rather 1,000 times go down with my brother farmers than fatten their expense. Tillman declared, allying himself rhetorically with poor white men against other wealthy men. Tillman's rhetoric notwithstanding, no sharp line separated agricultural and merchant capital. Throughout the post-Reconstruction decades, planters became merchants and merchants became planters. During the last decades of the century, men committed to mercantile, industrial, and financial development built mills, stores, and banks. Settlements became villages and towns, and their leading citizens competed with one another to attract railroad lines and investment. Whether they had been planters, yeomen, factors, or Yankees, members of this emerging town class saw agriculture as only one among many enterprises. Tillman shared certain goals with such men like New South visionaries. He urged farmers to produce more food and less cotton, and he owned a few shares of stock in local banks. But Tillman's orientation remained defiantly agricultural, and he professed enormous skepticism about this rising economic order. He feared a new South in which half our lands will be owned by aliens and the sons of many old slaveholders will have sunk to the level of their former servants, hewers of wood and drawers of water for capitalists and merchants. White men's hardship and sometimes their ignorance allowed those former servants to contribute to the agricultural crisis. We have turned our land over to the Negroes to manage, Tillman complained, the Anglo-Saxon abdicating in favor of the African, brains and energy giving place to muscle and ignorance. In part, white men were playing out the lessons they had learned during slavery, valuing labor over land and therefore tolerating their workers' destructive farming practices. It was for this reason that Tillman called slaves and slavery a curse on the antebellum South. Now that land, not slaves, had become the source of wealth and value in Southern agriculture, he urged farmers to pay more attention to how their tenants and laborers tilled the soil. Freedmen could not farm intelligently on their own account. Cuff, freed from the dread of a master, does as little as he can, Tillman explained, offering a familiar post-Reconstruction vision of black indolence and incapacity. A white man who rented to ignorant, lazy Negroes was therefore encouraging the butchery of his land. Agricultural renewal would be impossible as long as white landowners and tenants took their orders from cotton-obsessed furnishing merchants, and landowners allowed black sharecroppers and day-to-day autonomy they so ardently sought. Whether or not they considered themselves farmers, black South Carolinians lacked the capacity for citizenship that would make them eligible for inclusion in Tillman's farmers' movement. Although it appears that early on black farmers sometimes successfully sought to participate in local reform movement activities, the fact that blacks constituted a majority of the state's farmers did not interest Tillman. The farmers were white men. Indeed, Tillman and other agricultural reformers sometimes seemed to yearn for a South emptied of African Americans. We must get rid of these Negroes who are eating up the whites, Tillman told a county fair audience in 1886. But as a large landowner, Tillman would hardly have agreed with the bitter Edgefield farmer who declared in 1889 that planters who labor with their own hands are independent of the Negro, and if those who presume to be our leaders would not retain hundreds upon their plantations, we would not be confronted with the Southern problem. Tillman might have employed dozens rather than hundreds of black laborers, but he sought to control them, to master them, not to make them disappear. Black labor largely underwrote his kind of independence. But when blacks stepped out of white men's fields, Tillman argued, and especially when they entered politics, they threatened to bring back Reconstruction's radical misrule. Although the Republicans did not seriously contest statewide elections after 1882, they remained locally active. During the 1880s and early 1890s, African Americans continued to vote and hold office, especially in the low country counties, constituting the state's vast gerrymandered Black 7th congressional district. Despite challenges by white Democrats, black men such as Robert Smalls and George W. Murray periodically represented South Carolina in Congress. The possibility of a political resurgence by the black majority lingered in every development of the early post-Reconstruction decades, threatening at any moment to undo the Revolution of 1876. But Tillman believed that Negro domination would not return without aid from villainous white men. Like a writer to the Charleston News and Courier, he saw black voters as credulous, ignorant, and suspicious. Just the material to be as plastic as putty in the hands of shrewd and ambitious leaders. By the early 1890s, such leaders' reputations for malfaction had transcended the legendary and become more or less a cult. To white Democrats, men like Reconstruction governors Franklin Moses, Robert Scott, and Daniel Chamberlain were no longer simply carpetbaggers and scallywags, but vampires and phantasmagorical ghosts, so demonized in defeat that only supernatural language could describe their ghastly doings and the horrors that would follow their return. Tillman also argued that apportionment schemes favoring the low country continued the antebellum tradition of using the black majority against white farmers. In both the state legislature and Democratic Party conventions, methods of apportionment based on total population allowed the low country's tiny white minorities to speak with a louder voice than that of their more numerous upcountry cousins. The current Democratic leaders profited from the status quo and therefore refused either to reapportion the legislature or to modify the convention system of nominating state officers. Continuing Martin Gary and George Tillman's appeal to upcountry sectionalism, Ben Tillman argued that upcountry white men's overthrow of Reconstruction had earned them the right to greater representation. An Edgefield correspondent pointed to the county's large and overwhelmingly Democratic returns in the years since 1876 and asked whether the very citadel of the democracy is to be denied just representation. Tillman made the charge more racially pointed. He reckoned that a legislature from Edgefield represented 9,000 people, whereas one from Charleston or Richland represented 5,000 or 6,000 people, mostly Negroes, complaining further that one white man in Spartanburg or Edgefield should certainly be equal to one Negro in Charleston or Columbia. Tillman made his white urban opponents invisible and the cities they cherished essentially black. He also argued that the convention system was an affront to democracy and an invitation to rule by a political aristocracy. They make us delegate our power to delegates who delegate somebody else, he complained, so that by the time they reach Columbia, they are nothing but office-seeking politicians. At the 1886 Democratic Convention, however, opponents of primaries and reapportionment unselfconsciously made arguments that smacked of patrician superiority. If candidates for the state offices had to mount popular campaigns seeking support from individual voters across the state, one delegate suggested men would get into office simply upon their capital or be beholden to railroad companies for free passes. Men without means would either be denied office or be subject to corporation influence. Governor John P. Richardson perceived a more practical drawback, noting that every dissatisfied element flocks to Tillman's standard at once. He feared the Edgefield upstart might actually win the gubernatorial nomination if the party held a primary. Tillman's main campaign was not for office, however, but for the establishment of a state college for white farmers. Real agricultural advancement, Tillman argued, could take place only if the state reconsidered its educational priorities and established a freestanding agricultural college, a place where young men could learn progressive scientific farming. by training a cadre of young white men each year in the latest agricultural methods, the state could exchange the antebellum pattern of cut down, wear out, and move west for scientific agriculture and diversification focused on food crops. He contrasted the potential benefits of such a college with the shortcomings of the state's existing institutions for white men, Columbia's South Carolina College and Charleston's Citadel. These were schools for effeminate dandies and parasites, not manly farmers. Echoing both Gary and the Greenbackers, he portrayed South Carolina College, alma mater of half the state leadership, as elitist and ornamental. Having been taught that labor is degrading, the liberally educated graduates of such schools could easily become helpless beings, too proud to beg, too honest to steal, too lazy to work. The college's inadequate agricultural annex, which received the state's Moral Act money, was a child put to nurse in the house of its enemies. Defenders of the existing institutions and foes of the agricultural college suggested that collective solutions could not resolve essentially individual problems. Farmers' poverty resulted from laziness or incompetence, and those who worked hard would succeed without the state intervention, Tillman championed. If the legislature granted every request made by the farmers, this alone would not materially better their condition, wrote a Charleston planter, rejecting an overture from a Tillman organizer. The material interest of any class can only be improved by the individual efforts of the numbers of that class. He therefore opposed a farmers' political party. Another foe of the agricultural college put it more succinctly: the farmers' movement is a good thing, he quipped, if it's a brisk one between the plow handles. Such opponents of his efforts, Tillman charged, were effete aristocrats living off of inherited wealth, a corrupt ring embodying all the evils of aristocracy with none of its benefits. The farmer, Tillman said, looked on as his tax money was wasted, and he himself was contemptuously pushed aside to make room for men who are really his inferiors in intelligence and honesty, and who are selfish in all their aspirations. Their absurdities, extravagance, and folly recall the fiscal excesses of radical misrule. Even the agricultural college would fail unless real farmers controlled it, for it could not be entrusted to the current agricultural leadership of broken-down politicians and old, superannuated bourbon aristocrats who are thoroughly incompetent and who worship the past and are incapable of progress of any sort, but who boldly assume to govern us by divine right. These men, Tillman explained, the remnant of the old regime, worship the past and are marching backwards when they march at all. As these attacks suggest, Tillman's understanding of political and economic virtue was sharply gendered, but it was not based on a simple opposition of male independence to female dependence. Rather, it offered a vision of male and female agricultural independence under siege from men whose unproductive and aristocratic ways undercut their claim to leadership and perhaps even to manhood itself. Tillman rooted both masculine and feminine virtue in productive labor. In one of his most provocative attacks, he dubbed the Citadel, a military institution dear to upper-class Charleston, a military dude factory, and called for its transformation into a college for white women. More than simply derogating the school and its graduates, Tillman implied that such men had less value than the female graduates the new school would produce. But proper education for white women, far more than a slap at urban dudes, was an essential part of Tillman's vision of a prosperous agricultural commonwealth. A Barnwell newspaper echoed Tillman's analysis when it asserted that if the funds that have been expended on worthless young men in South Carolina alone since the war had been appropriated to the business education of women, scores of homes would have been spared by mortgages and ample support made for families who have been dragged down to want. Tillmanite legislators included schools for our beautiful girls in the list of changes that would bring dignity for labor. Tillman spoke in joking but respectful and affectionate terms of his own wife's perspective on his agitation. "You don't know how many candle lectures I have received," he told the 1886 Farmers' Convention, "and I think I will take Mrs. Moses's advice hereafter if I can only get out of this scrimmage without losing my scalp." He claimed that his agitation had initiated conversations between other husbands and wives as well, and families are split and husbands and wives are in some cases on opposite sides. White farming women clearly had at least a consultative role in the body politique. By contrast, Tillman suggested aristocrats misunderstood white women's proper roles in predictably haughty ways. The urban Columbia campus of the state university received the state's federal money for agricultural education, but Tillman insisted that although the college subsisted in part on this stolen farmers' money, it could never be a fitting temple for our sun-browned goddess, agriculture. In its halls, he explained, agriculture occupied the position of a bond slave, only tolerated because of her dower. She was never made one of the family. Instead of recognizing sun-browned skin as the badge of a white woman's agricultural labor, aristocrats had mistaken her for an African-American slave and unfairly appropriated the fruits of her labor. If these men could mistake Cerise for a slave, they could not be relied on to grant white farming women and their labor the respect they deserved. The rule of the aristocrats had disordered South Carolina's broader household, for under them the state has proved a veritable stepmother to her agricultural interests, Tillman complained, and they have been neglected or subordinated to everything else. In order to suggest the corrupting influence of non-producers' rule, Tillman explained that in the years since redemption, the Democratic Party, that interesting old lady, had become somewhat corpulent and slouchy. His farmers' movement, however, had stirred her from her lethargy, causing her to recognize among the farmers who are here this familiar face, and that which she remembered as among the foremost of those who redeemed the state in 76. Moved by that memory, Tillman went on. She resolved to reward the farmers instead of the undeserving offspring who had up until now claimed precedence. I know who to depend upon, and if these boys are going to move, I'm going to follow them. I can't depend on your city chaps and lawyers any longer. Determining to move back to the farm, the party mother explained that my health has not been good of late, and I am nearly dead for a piece of home-cured bacon and cornbread. But the return to agricultural ways wrought a miraculous transformation. Once she rejoined a farming household, the Democratic mother no longer simply craved homemade provisions, but could help produce them, declaring that these farmers ought to raise more meat and corn, and I am going to show them how to do it. No longer a weakened, inattentive stepmother, she had become a nurturing household member with an important role in the process of social and economic regeneration. But masculine virtues differed from feminine virtues in at least one crucial respect. Men were supposed to be soldiers, capable of the kind of collective military action that had produced the victory of 1876. Here again, Tillman argued that the Democratic leadership mistakenly emphasized the honor of individual men rather than understanding martial virtues as essentially collective. Individual dudes were nothing. An army of white men was everything. In the 1880s, when most leading Democrats could point to Confederate war record, the memory and legacy of 1876 served Tillman extremely well. Tillman's red shirt service became evidence of his personal courage, but more important, it became evidence of his boundless commitment to white male authority. In confrontations with low country leaders, he boasted of being one of the Hamburg rioters who dared even the devil to save the state, and he continually lambasted the Charleston News and Courier for its initially critical response to that now legendary massacre. When an opponent suggested that Tillman had shirked his duty as a white man by failing to serve in the Confederate Army, Tillman not only told the story of the loss of his eye, but added that instead of a Civil War record, I have a little record of 1876, and I know something about Ned Tennant and the Ellington riots, and have had a little to do with managing elections. Anyone who had been with him at Hamburg, he told an upcountry crowd, would not say that he, Tillman, could split the Democratic Party. That is awesome. That is awesome. I just had to pause for a moment to bragging. Are you going to challenge my credentials? I mean, do you remember what I did to those niggas up in Hamburg? I mean, that is incredible. And his statue still chilling. State grounds, South Carolina, along with Winthrop University, Clemson University in South Carolina, among other places. I think his reported birth house or wherever in Edgefield, I think they have some sort of marker there as well. Just all over the place. Context of White Supremacy. We'll pick up there next week, so we'll be on the top of 121 for next week. If folks would like to participate, the number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. We have about 30 minutes, so we should have ample time if you think you have something you want to share. If you please don't wait till the last minute. If you think you might want to chime in, if something struck you that you want to share, just go ahead, dial in, put your hand up, and we will make sure that you get an opportunity to share. Everybody who dialed in with a hand up should be with us. Feel free.
Yes. I think that as the book goes on, it's the same theme over and over. When it comes to Bill Tillman, it's constant oppression of black, and he made a career off of this, and now he's governor, and he's probably in the future going to do more harm than he did before he took office. He's under the disguise of helping the common man, the average farmer, and he has all this backing, and it's remarkable that although it's all rhetoric, that everybody's buying it. I also learned that Wade Hampton's monument is on the state capitol ground in South Carolina also. Now, he was a racist, and there's been some news about that in recent days about the removal of it. But almost everything he said all the way through is just to guarantee that white supremacy, guarantee that white male comes out on top. And that's my comment.
Pretty direct. Any of the other folks that have a hand up should be with us if you have anything you want to share. maybe nothing stood out from the second portion. I think I had been saying for a couple weeks that we really hadn't even got into his career and, how he earned the statues and monuments that he has all over the place. So we have a little bit more than half of the book to go to really see, what did he do to earn all of these monuments and how connected that is with terrorizing black people. So it should be time to listen up and pay attention. I thought on 116, even though that speech where we ended it, I thought that was significant as well. But back on 116, I think we talked about the hypocrisy and just when we say that white people are master deceivers. This, and I have heard this from other white people. That was kind of why it stuck out to me. It even reminded me when we've had discussions about Faces at the Bottom of the Well, Derek Bell, his book, and he has the space traders anecdote about if white people could get rid of black people, would they do it? And in his anecdote, his short story, white people sell all the black people away. And the white author of Fahrenheit 451, I think it's Ray Bradbury, he also wrote a short story about black people leaving planet Earth, and it's different. This white guy, his story, the white people end up, even the most racist of white people, they end up being furious and trying to stop the black people from leaving because they don't want them to go. And I think Mr. Fuller has said you got to have niggers to practice racism on 116, where it says that they are talking all this nonsense about getting rid of black people. It says the farmers were white men indeed. Tillman and other agricultural reformers sometimes seem to yearn for a South emptied of African Americans. We must get rid of the Negroes who are eating up the whites, Tillman told a county fair audience in 1886. But as a large landowner, Tillman would hardly have agreed with the bitter Edgefield farmer who declared in 1889 that planters who labor with their own hands are independent of the Negro, and if those who presume to be our leaders would not retain hundreds upon their plantations, we would not be confronted with the Southern problem. And it just talks about how this Tillman having this wealth and being able to do all of these things in his career was hugely aided by the fact that he enslaved many black people. He and his family enslaved black people. So he certainly would not have wanted to see black people be booted out of South Carolina, and that lie is there consistently. I think that's why Mr. Fuller says that if white people wanted to get rid of black people, they could do that. They like this. They like having us around to torture, abuse, and mistreat. It would be easy. Who would defend us? They just enjoy this sort of thing. If you're going to practice racism, you got to have niggers. Very important point, I thought. The person that dialed in, our Bay Area caller, should be with us as well, as well as the other folks. Did you have something to share?
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I had to step outside. I'm at work. I noticed, and in reading as I was driving here, that even in both segments, they literally, it just sounds like a fear of a black planet. It just sounds like they're just so fearful, Caucasians, of black empowerment, or us kind of basically coming into alignment. And I noticed even with the women, even because sometimes they'll state in reading, or when they say something about oppressed people, they'll bring up women and women, but the women weren't oppressed. Now, they may have been treated a particular way, but nothing compared to, even with the ones that had to do labor, they called them golden goddesses. Like, they never said anything about that, about black people or black women. So there was a hierarchy for even with the white women, because they always state as if white women are so oppressed, but in that book, they didn't sound oppressed. They sounded like maybe they were even merging them together, uniting with the women against us. So it's like their fight is to make sure they collectively control us. Sometimes I wonder about some of the movements, the women's movements. Is it a fight to be able to control us So that's kind of all I wanted to state. I noticed that I love this book. At first I was a little leery, but I love this book because it's just straight concrete. It's just straight raw and uncut. He just hits it with everything, all the venom, all the animosity, all the anger, all the energy. Like you state, they burn midnight oil coming up with plans, scams, and schemes to make sure that we're controlled. And I'll let someone else speak. And
Appreciate that. Yeah, that is one thing that you get, I'd say, if you kind of go back and read some of the older content. It is a lot less filtered. It's pretty explicit, like he's quoting. I was chuckling because I've heard this before. The speech. This is where they're complaining about black people. I was insulted just for our ancestors when they were saying freedmen could not farm intelligently on their own account. And this is like the generic slave name, Cuff, C-U-F-F, Cuff. And I've seen that before, where whites are referring to enslaved black people as Cuff or Cuffy. I've seen that throughout. I mean, it's as common as like Bill or Bob or Ted. Anyway, so Cuff, freed from the dread of a master, does as little as he can, Tillman explained, offering a familiar post-Reconstruction vision of black indolence and capacity. As I said, I was offended just the gargantuan disrespect for black people who brought astronomical expertise about agriculture and farming that the white enslavers had no knowledge of, and they just totally appropriated and used that knowledge to just further terrorize and gain all this massive wealth, but to insult and say that you're letting these ignorant niggers out in your field and they're just messing up your land. They don't know what they're doing, and we need to have more intelligent black. Just the constant disrespect that black people could have any sort of knowledge or know-how. And I think it even said earlier in the book when he was struggling back during the Civil War and he was still pretty young, like in his late teen. He didn't want to give credit to the black person, the black enslaved black person that was showing him how to do everything on the farm, because he didn't know any better. It's that same pattern of just constantly disparaging and degrading black people that, in my view, is being honest. That continuation. That's why his statue is still there on the campus of the state capitol grounds, and Tillman Hall at Clemson, Tillman Hall at Winthrop University, and all those other spots, in my opinion. Even the staff, when they came out today and released their statement, they didn't take anything down. They didn't rename the faculty. Let's see. Ignorant black people. Yeah, that's constant. Black people are stupid, of course. I thought it was interesting, too, the way that they were talking about the way that you could skillfully use the term farmer and be vague about it so that you're not really clear, even though sometimes they would just try and boil it down that farmers meant white men, generically speaking. Sometimes it would be something else, but just being confusing and vague with terms. That's standard operating procedure, still 2015 for the racist team. Let's see. Anything else stand out, folks? Second audio segment.
Yes, did he start talking about founding a college or institution for white women so that they could enrich their learning? That was interesting when, at a time when they don't have any rights to speak of, but they're active participants in this white supremacy. And then he wants to advance them, but then there's no recognition of suffrage or, the right to own any land.
Yeah, I think that's super important, particularly for this time period, for him advocating for a college for white women. That is astronomical, and particularly in a book that is called Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy. If that is what his goal was, if he apparently thinks that establishing an institution for white women is a central aspect to reconstructing white supremacy, that is huge in terms of the role of white women, which is that's what I've been saying all week. I feel like that was the article I wrote. That was what I said when we had Lori Essick on the program, and she kept trying to emphasize and stuff sexism and patriarchy on us, that white women play a huge role. And it looks like Ben Tillman, for all of his people can say he's crude and uncouth and this, that, and the other, Ben Tillman recognized that white women play an astronomical role, and he wanted to refine and make her even more powerful. And see, I thought even in the report, it seemed he was suggesting that having this college for white women would be more important than the Citadel. I mean, that is incredible, particularly for this period of time, as Mr. Demery said. I mean, that is huge. I would definitely encourage folks to think about that. That Ben Tillman, 19th century, is talking institution, white women, college of their own, so they can go to school and be better racists. Incredible.
Guys, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to let you know that I was I looked up the meaning of the word cup. I found it on a racial slur database, and they said that this is what it says. Heard used by white southern Georgia farmers to describe blacks. The origin is that blacks are always being arrested and being handcuffed by the police. So that's where cuff comes from.
Context of white supremacy. Even in the name.
Still happens today. Yes, still happens to this day.
Absolutely. Shackling. That's what we're supposed to be doing to them. That's in their very identity is being shackled by some racists. That, wow. I'm tracking through. I would think the Citadel is like a bastion of Ben Tillman's legacy as well, but I guess not if he had that to say about them. I don't know. I've not talked to any Citadel graduates or seen any writing in terms of what they have to say about him at the campus. But even with that dispute, the Citadel didn't allow any niggers until late in the 1960s, and with protests then, I mean, there are whole movies and books written about white terrorism on the campus of the Citadel. I've written about it myself. The caller at 3358, did you have remarks you wanted to get in?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask that question because I didn't get the what did the brother say he looked up, the word he looked up?
I looked up cuff. Yeah, cuff. Sorry, I beat my line.
Oh no, go ahead. It was fine.
That's why I couldn't understand it.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was the term cuff, and it refers to Georgia saying for black people, because black males in particular, because you are always found in handcuffs and being placed under arrest. So that's where that term comes from for white people that they use for us.
Okay, so you say cuff as in C-U-F-F, then, right?
Correct, yes.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just I'm listening in, trying to, because I'm not a very good. I got to work on my listening, so I'm still trying to figure out what's going on. As I'm listening. So when I listen to you guys talk about it, and it helps me understand better. And I got nothing to say right now. So.
All right, on. Yeah, no, that's all of us trying to do that. And I know, in my opinion, I know this is it's more challenging. I think the last time that I had to read a book was Richard Williams, Black and White, the way I see it, and that was an easier book to read than this one. So I know this is, and plus it's different time period and all. People don't, reading some of these passages, I was like, man, people don't even talk like this anymore. But if you can, process that, I think there's definitely some great tidbits in terms of helping you get a better understanding of what racism, white supremacy is, what it means to be white, and as I've said the whole time, hopefully this will give us a better understanding of what happened at Charleston Emanuel A.M.E. Church last month. 30 days on the nose today. With that, I'm flipping through. Anybody, any other comments they wanted to get in before we wrap up? Anything else? I think the sun-browned goddess, I think that is another example of projection for sure. I think we talked about that last week. We talked Dr. Welsing and her constant analysis of white people discreetly sometimes, and sometimes even more directly revealing their desire for melanin and pigmentation. I think that is another example right there, equating white women with sun-browned goddesses, and then even in this chapter using that same metaphor to equate with agriculture on the whole with Ben Tillman. I thought another illustration of projection. Might be important too as we read this to keep in mind that there are a high population at the time of the reading, very high population of black people in South Carolina. So that is, certainly an influencing factor. The high number of black folks. Even I think he said in the book a few times, white minority. I don't know if that's been odd for some people to hear, but he has used that consistently. I know he used it at least once this week and a few other times earlier in the book. But white people are heavily outnumbered in this area, and so that has an impact. White supremacy, they could do it the other way around too, but they are heavily outnumbered, so that does have a bearing on how they're processing what needs to be done in these different cases. With that, making sure I didn't overlook anything before we move on. We should be next week, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, moving forward. Page 121 on chapter 4. We should be in tomorrow with the compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, and 6 p.m. Pacific. We will have our Sunday, once a month. Sunday, we'll be here early, 12 noon Eastern, 11 a.m. Central, and 9 a.m. Pacific this Sunday. We'll be on, particularly for our listeners who are outside the states, for them to have an opportunity to come on, share. For folks who, even if you are in the States but you just can't participate during the normal time that we're on, you'll have an opportunity this Sunday morning at, I guess folks on the East Coast, it would be 12 noon, but significantly earlier than our normal time. For folks that are like UK GMT, I think that would be 5 p.m. So it'd be Sunday afternoon. Folks should have an opportunity to chime in. I think I hit. Oh, did I miss somebody? Somebody have a comment?
Yes, Gus, I have one question. I was wondering, does this book get around to saying what happened to his eye?
I think they covered it already. I think earlier when he got, he had the illness when he was, I think, around 20-ish or so. This might have been. The Civil War was still going on. Like this was, I think a ways back, like 30s, checking around like page 30s, 40s, somewhere in there, 30s, 50s. It was maybe I think the second week that we did it. But yeah, he got like an illness during the Civil War, and it ended up messing with I forgot which eye it was, but whichever one he lost, that it came in that illness where he ended up having to convalesce for a significant number of months. This is like around, I think, 18. The Civil War is going on when this happens. I can flip back and find it really quick, but it's should have been covered already.
Okay, thanks. I noticed the last reading mentioned something about a white woman being mistaken for a black person or a slave, and he used that in the context of, that's what things have come to, and that's when he started talking about advancement and education for the white women.
Yep, absolutely. I'm talking about they didn't have, couldn't be trusted to accurately assess value of the white woman, and this is which again that is remarkable for this period of time, and particularly for a book that is so much emphasizing that this is white male patriarchy, that the central patriarch, if you will, white patriarch, if you will, is staunchly advocating for white women to get this institution, and that they're not even being valued correctly, that they're being seen as Negroes, the horror of it all. I'll see if I can flip back, if I can't find it in like the next second or two, the exact page where it talks about his illness. Oh yeah, that would have to be quite a ways back. I thought it was relatively early. I'll stick with what I said, like around the 50s and 60s. But I'll shoot you an email when I get the exact page number. Anything else before we wrap things up? Anything else?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thought about that term "press" again, and it brought back to my memory. There was a young Chicago rapper who was actually an up-and-coming rapper who was murdered, and he had a song where he sang about the term "press," but it was slang for Chicago, and it was slang for being in a relationship with a black female versus just having sex with them. So it made me think of the fact of, again, us adopting terms that are derogatory that white people use for us, and then basically degrading ourselves with those same terms. So I just wanted to chime in with that.
Right on. Yep, that is the contamination of white supremacy. We pick up a lot of their terms, unfortunately. Anything else? Miss anybody else? Cool in the gang. I'll assume everyone is all good. Again, we should be back next Friday, segment number 5. We should be hitting the halfway point of the book next week, closing in. If you have questions, commentary, if you're listening to the archives and want to send in feedback, drop an email, untiljustice@gmail.com. Address again, untiljustice@gmail.com. We are fundraising for the summer of 2015. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Listener supported, counter-racist radio. The PayPal button, it's on my blog, top right corner. You should see it. If you are not into PayPal, drop me an email and we will get you a physical mailing address. Thanks to all the folks who have invested down through the years and kept the cows rolling for six and a half years, I guess, at this point. Hope it has been helpful for folks to get a better understanding of what racism is, how it works. Thank you all for contributing, and hopefully we remain worthy of your time and energy. That said, if you're going to be out, have fun this weekend. Enjoy the sunshine, do your thing. Just make sure you remain codified. You do not want to make it easy for racists to make problems for you. I would encourage sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. If you can't do sobriety, at minimum, just be codified. You don't want to be consuming alcohol around a lot of white people. I really discourage being in environments where it's a lot of white people who are under the influence. It can get ugly quick. I mean, your whole life can change in the blink of an eye. Just white people under any circumstance, if they are intoxicated, that makes them even more dangerous. Male, female, child. Certainly, if you're going to consume any alcohol, you do not want to be behind the wheel, or other intoxicants. You don't want to be behind the wheel. That just makes it super easy for Timothy Loman, Darren Wilson to do whatever they want. Now they have justification. I would even be cautious about being a passenger or even a pedestrian
Race soldiers will use any reason to ruin your day. I would also be mindful about the other victims that you're going to be around. If people are going to be consuming intoxicants, just a lot of times people do not make the best decisions when they are under the influence. Just be mindful of all that. If you are going to consume, make sure that it does not create any unnecessary and easily avoidable problems. That's it. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people, victims of racism. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. Remind us that we have eternal enemies, and those enemies are white. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.